The letter was not meant for Eleanor's hands. It had been placed on the silver tray in the hallway by a housemaid who had confused the rooms, who had perhaps been new or distracted or simply unlucky. And because of that single small mistake, Eleanor Hartwell picked it up on a Thursday morning while the house was still quiet and the kettle had not yet boiled. She stood in the corridor in her dressing gown, her dark hair still loose, and she read 5 lines before she understood what she was reading. Then she read those 5 lines again. The letter was from Duke Aldrich Voss. It was addressed to her father, and it was asking, in careful and formal language, for a private meeting to discuss the matter of Vivienne. Eleanor stood very still for a long moment. The house breathed around her. A clock ticked somewhere behind a closed door. Outside, birds were doing what birds do in the early morning, singing without any knowledge of what was happening inside that stone manor, without any awareness that the world for one particular woman had just shifted beneath her feet in a way that could not be unshifted. She folded the letter back into its original crease. She placed it on the tray exactly as she had found it, and then she walked to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of tea, sat down at the small wooden table by the window, and did not cry. Not yet, not there. Eleanor Hartwell had grown up learning that tears were a private thing. Her mother had taught her that before dying of a fever when Eleanor was 11 years old. Her father, Lord Gerald Hartwell, had taught her nothing useful about grief. He had simply remarried within 2 years and turned his full attention toward the household's social ambitions, which increasingly meant Vivienne. Eleanor had watched that shift happen slowly, and then all at once, the way some things do. One day she was simply less important than she had been the day before, and the day after that she was less important still, and by the time she was old enough to name what had happened, she had already grown so accustomed to the quiet of being overlooked that she had started to mistake it for peace. She was not a woman who attracted easy attention. She knew this about herself without bitterness. She was not the kind of beautiful that stopped a room. She was the kind that made certain people, on certain evenings, look twice. She was thoughtful where Vivienne was quick. She was careful where Vivienne was bold. She preferred books to ballrooms, and she had never once in her 26 years of life worn a dress that made her feel uncomfortable just to impress someone who probably wasn't worth impressing anyway. Vivienne was 23. Vivienne had worn every dress ever made for her with the ease of someone who believed she deserved all of them, which perhaps she did, and perhaps that was the point. Vivienne had the kind of face that painters wanted to paint and the kind of laugh that men remembered. She walked into a room and something happened to the air in it. She was not cruel, not exactly. She was simply someone who had always gotten what she wanted, and had therefore never developed the habit of considering what wanting something might cost anyone else. Eleanor had known for 3 years that Duke Aldrich Voss was courting her. He had been introduced to her at a winter gathering hosted by the Pemberton family, where Eleanor had been persuaded to attend by a friend who had since moved to the countryside, and therefore could not be held accountable for what followed. Aldrich had found her near the bookcase, which should have told her something about the kind of woman he was looking for, but did not, because Eleanor had been 23 at the time and still inclined toward optimism in the way that 23-year-olds sometimes are. He was handsome in a controlled sort of way, the kind of man who was always perfectly dressed and never had a hair out of place and seemed to experience emotions only in carefully managed amounts. He had spoken to Eleanor for 40 minutes that first evening, and he had asked her questions, which she had appreciated, because most men at most gatherings did not ask questions. He had seemed genuinely interested in her answers. He had remembered what she said when he saw her again 2 weeks later. He had asked to call on her. He had continued calling on her, season after season, with a consistency that everyone in her small social world had interpreted as courtship. Eleanor had interpreted it the same way. She was not naive enough to be certain of his feelings, but she had been careful enough with her own to invest in them quietly, without announcing them, without building them into a declaration that could be used against her. She had come to look forward to his visits. She had come to trust the steadiness of them. She had told her closest friend, a quiet woman named Catherine who lived 3 houses down and baked exceptional lemon cakes, that she believed things were moving in the right direction. She had been wrong. The letter proved it. And now, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea going cold, Eleanor allowed herself to understand the full shape of what had been happening. Aldrich had been using his visits to her as a reason to be in the house. She was the door he had knocked on while he waited for the real door to open. The real door was Vivienne. The real plan had been Vivienne all along. Eleanor did not know that Thursday morning exactly when Vivienne had noticed Aldrich's interest and decided to do something about it. She did not know whether it had been weeks or months, whether it had begun with a look or a conversation or something more deliberate. She would find out later, in pieces, through the awkward confessions of housemaids and the careful silences of her father. But that morning she knew only what the letter told her, which was enough. She put her teacup in the sink. She dressed herself quietly. She went about her day. She did not confront anyone. Not yet. This was a conscious decision, and it was not born of weakness. Eleanor had a particular quality that very few people had ever appreciated in her, which was the ability to hold difficult information without letting it spill everywhere immediately. She could carry a heavy thing quietly. She had been doing it most of her life. She knew that confronting her father before she had the full picture would only result in him managing the conversation in a way that suited him, and that confronting Vivian before she was ready would give Vivian time to prepare a response that would make Eleanor look like the one who had made a mistake. She needed to know everything first. Then she would decide what to do with it. So she watched. She listened. She helped Vivian choose fabric for a new dress without letting on that she knew anything. While Vivian chattered happily about how she had always found the Duke rather interesting. Hadn't Eleanor noticed? He had such a particular way of speaking, don't you think? Eleanor said yes, she supposed he did, and passed the blue silk without dropping it. She sat at dinner while her father made careful conversation about upcoming social seasons and who might be invited where, and she ate her food and responded when addressed and gave away nothing. She waited. 10 days after she had found the letter, her father called both daughters into his study. He was seated behind his wide oak desk in the way he always seated himself when he had information to deliver, with a formality that he used to signal importance. Vivian was already smiling when they walked in, which meant she already knew, which meant the meeting had been planned to tell Eleanor rather than to tell both of them together. Lord Hartwell straightened a pen on his desk and cleared his throat. He explained that Duke Aldrich Voss had made a formal request. He had done Eleanor the slight courtesy of not quite looking at her while he said this. He explained that Vivian had accepted the request, and that he himself had given his blessing, and that the engagement would be formally announced within the fortnight. He said it was a wonderful opportunity for the family. He said Vivian deserved happiness. He said that he hoped Eleanor would support her sister in this. He did not say anything about what Eleanor deserved. He did not appear to notice the gap. Vivian turned to Eleanor with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and triumphant at the same time, which Eleanor had to admit was an impressive thing to pull off. She said, "I hope you are not too disappointed, Ellie." She said it the way people say things they do not actually hope at all. Eleanor looked at her sister for a long moment. She took in the careful brightness of Vivian's eyes and the way she was holding her hands together at her waist, and she understood that this was a moment Vivian had been rehearsing. Eleanor did not give her the version of the scene she had rehearsed for. She said, "I hope you will both be very happy." Then she excused herself from the study, walked upstairs to her room, closed the door behind her, and sat on the edge of her bed for a very long time. What she felt was not what she might have expected to feel, or what a reader of romantic novels might expect to feel in her position. She was not destroyed. She was not collapsed. She was angry, yes. There was a cold, steady anger in her that she recognized and respected as a true feeling. But underneath the anger was something else, something she did not immediately have a name for. She thought about the 3 years. She thought about every conversation she had believed was genuine, every visit she had looked forward to, every small kindness she had read as sincerity. She thought about what it meant that she had been used as a social convenience, a way for a man to spend time in a house where the woman he actually wanted lived, without any awkwardness. She had been, as he would later confirm with his own cold words, a placeholder, a seat kept warm for someone more interesting. And then she thought about something else. She thought about the fact that she was 26 years old and still living in her father's house and still waiting for her own life to begin, and that perhaps the question was not only what Aldrich had done but also what she had allowed herself to become, a woman who waited, a woman who held her breath and stayed quiet and trusted the steadiness of things that were not actually steady at all. She did not cry that evening. What she did instead was get up from the edge of her bed, go to her writing desk, and open the small notebook where she kept lists of things she wanted to do that she had been quietly postponing. There were 14 items on the list. She read all of them. She picked up a pen, and she made herself a promise that was not dramatic and not spoken aloud but was as real as anything she had ever felt in her life. She was done waiting. She did not yet know what that meant in practice. She did not yet know about a king, or a royal messenger, or a ceremony that would be remembered in that part of the country for the next 30 years. She knew only what she had decided, which was that from that evening forward, the life she was living was going to belong to her, and not to anyone else's plan for her. What she also did not know was that she had been seen. Not that evening, not in that room, but 6 months earlier, on a wet afternoon in a small town 30 miles from Hartwell Manor, when a flood had damaged half the lower district, and Eleanor had driven out there with 2 farm carts full of supplies, and had spent 11 hours organizing relief efforts with the kind of clear-headed calm that most people in emergencies cannot manage. She had not done it for recognition, she had done it because it needed doing, and she knew how to do it. She had not announced herself or sought anyone's thanks. She had simply worked, and directed, and kept things moving, and at the end of it she had loaded herself back into the cart, and gone home with mud on her boots, and not said a word about it to her father or her sister. One man among the crowd of observers that afternoon had not been a local. He had been traveling without identification, accompanied by 2 companions, who dressed like ordinary gentlemen but moved like something else entirely. He had watched Eleanor Hartwell for most of those 11 hours. He had asked one of the locals who she was. He had not been given a name he recognized. He had written 3 words in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, folded it closed, and continued watching. Eleanor did not know any of this. She was sitting at her writing desk making promises to herself, and the house was quiet, and downstairs her father and sister were probably having a pleasant evening together, and the world outside was doing what it always did without her permission or participation. She closed her notebook. She stood up. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the desk, not with vanity but with intention, the way a person looks when they are deciding something. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. She just did not yet know what next looked like. The morning after the announcement, Eleanor came down to breakfast to find a bouquet of pale roses on the table, a gift from Aldrich, delivered early, addressed to Vivian. The card was tucked into the stems and Eleanor did not read it, but she noticed that the handwriting on the envelope was precise and controlled, the same handwriting she had seen in 3 letters delivered to her over the course of 2 years, letters full of carefully managed warmth that she had kept in a wooden box under her bed, because she had believed they meant something. She excused herself from breakfast before Vivian came down. She went to her room, pulled the box from under the bed, and removed the 3 letters. She read them once more, slowly, with her new understanding laid over them like a lens. She was looking for something she had missed, some signal, some small crack in the language, where the truth might have been showing through without her noticing. She found something more uncomfortable instead. She found that the letters were good. They were careful and observant and just warm enough. They had been written by a man who knew exactly what words to use and had used them deliberately. There was no crack in the language because the language had been chosen to prevent cracks. And she put the letters back in the box. She put the box in the back of her wardrobe behind a stack of winter blankets, and she went downstairs and helped plan a wedding. This was the true beginning of something that would take months to understand, not the ending of something, though it felt like one. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor Hartwell became the most organized, most reliable, most quietly essential person in the planning of her sister's marriage to the man who had spent 3 years standing in her hallway, pretending to be there for her. She addressed envelopes. She consulted with florists. She confirmed arrangements with the cathedral staff. She managed the household calendar so that every appointment landed on time, and nothing was missed, and no one ran out of energy or patience because Eleanor had quietly anticipated every need before it became a problem. She did this not out of submission. She did this because doing it well kept her from falling apart, and because she was not yet ready to show anyone what was actually happening inside her, and because the version of Eleanor that the world saw, composed, capable, unrattled, was the version she intended to keep presenting until she figured out what her next move was. Vivian accepted all of this help as her natural right, which was at least consistent. Her father thanked Eleanor once, briefly, for being so mature about everything. He used the word mature the way people use it when they mean quiet. Eleanor thanked him in return, and went back to the lists she was making. Aldrich came to the house often now, openly, for Vivian. He and Eleanor passed each other in corridors and at the dinner table and once in the garden, where he stopped and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Not quite guilt, not quite satisfaction, something between the two. He said good afternoon. She said good afternoon. Neither of them said anything else. She walked past him with her back straight and her pace unhurried, and she did not look back. 3 days after that garden encounter, Catherine, her friend 3 houses down, the baker of lemon cakes, came to visit and found Eleanor in the sitting room, with a pen and 3 lists and a cup of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. Catherine sat down across from her, looked at the lists, looked at Eleanor's face, and said nothing for a full minute, which was one of the things Eleanor loved about her. Then Catherine said, "You are planning something." Eleanor looked up. "I am planning a wedding." "That is not what I mean, and you know it." Eleanor put her pen down. She looked at Catherine for a moment, at her steady, sensible face and the way she was waiting without pressure, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest that she had not realized was tight. "I made myself a promise," Eleanor said. "What kind of promise?" "The kind you make when you realize you have been standing in the wrong place waiting for the wrong thing to happen." Catherine considered this. "That is a good kind of promise," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" Eleanor picked her pen back up. "I am still working that out," she said, "but I will know it when I see it." And she would. She did not yet know that what she was going to see first was a royal messenger standing in the front hall of Hartwell Manor with a letter bearing a gold seal, asking for a woman that nobody in the household had thought to ask for in a very long time. She did not yet know that the person who had been watching her on that wet afternoon in the flooded district had not forgotten what he saw, that he had gone home and asked questions and made inquiries in the careful, private way that only certain kinds of men can manage, that he had decided something, and that his decisions, unlike most people's, had the weight of an entire kingdom behind them. Eleanor Hartwell did not know any of that yet. She was sitting in her sitting room with 3 lists and a cold cup of coffee and a friend who baked lemon cakes, and she was working out how to begin. Outside, the roses Aldrich had sent were still on the breakfast table. A petal had fallen. Nobody had picked it up. That evening, before she went to bed, Eleanor opened her notebook again. She did not add to the list of 14 things she wanted to do. Instead, she wrote one sentence at the top of a fresh page, in her careful, even handwriting, and underlined it once. She wrote, "From this point forward, everything is mine." Then she closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and slept better than she had in months. Nobody warned Eleanor about the morning when Aldrich Voss would say the thing he said. Nobody thought to. The house was busy with planning. Her father was busy congratulating himself, and Vivian was busy being the center of everything, which was the state she had always found most natural. Eleanor had simply been moving through the days like someone who had decided not to break, which is a different thing from being unbroken. It happened on a Wednesday, 17 days after the engagement announcement. Eleanor was coming down the main staircase with a bundle of correspondence she had sorted for her father. Invitations, 2 letters related to the wedding guest list, and a bill from the florist that needed to be reviewed before it was approved. Aldrich was coming up the stairs from the entrance hall below, where the housemaid had let him in early for his visit with Vivian, who was not yet dressed and had sent a message down asking him to wait a few minutes in the sitting room. They met in the middle of the staircase, at the landing, where there was a wide window looking out over the garden and a small side table with a vase of dried lavender that had been there for as long as Eleanor could remember. It was a perfectly ordinary landing. There was nowhere for either of them to go without passing the other. Aldrich stopped. He looked at the correspondence in her hands. Then he looked at her face. He was, as always, impeccably dressed, with his dark coat and precisely knotted cravat, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he had a right to be exactly where he was. He said, "You seem to be keeping yourself busy." Eleanor said, "I am." She made no move to step aside. He continued looking at her in that measured way he had. "I want you to know," he said, "that I never intended for this to be difficult for you." Eleanor considered this sentence. She turned it over in her mind the way she would turn over a stone to see what was underneath. "Difficult," she said, not a question, just the word, placed back in the air between them. "You are a practical woman," he said. "I have always respected that about you." "I wonder," Eleanor said, "whether you have respected anything about me at all, but thank you." Something shifted in his face. It was very small and very quick, and if Eleanor had not been paying close attention, she would have missed it. But she had always paid close attention, even when nobody noticed she was doing it. The shift was not guilt, it was irritation, the particular irritation of someone who had expected the conversation to go one way and found it going another. "You were always the placeholder," he said. He said it quietly. He said it without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. He said it the way someone states a fact they believe is neutral, a piece of practical information, delivered without cruelty because the person delivering it does not see it as a cruel thing. He was telling her the truth, in his mind. He was explaining the situation with a clearness he apparently considered a kindness. Eleanor stood on the landing with the correspondence in her hands, and looked at Aldrich Voss for what she already suspected would be the last time she would truly look at him, not as someone she had cared about, not as someone who had wronged her, but simply as a person, fully seen, holding none of her remaining regard. She nodded once. She said, "I know what I was." She moved to the side so he could pass. He passed. She continued up the stairs. When she reached the upper corridor, she stopped walking. She stood still for a moment outside the linen room, where no one could see her, and she pressed the correspondence bundle against her chest and breathed slowly, in and out, until the thing inside her that wanted to be a very loud noise went quiet again. Then she went to her room, put the correspondence on her desk, and sat down. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning she found the letter on the tray, and she was not going to start now, but she sat for a long time. She sat long enough for the light in the room to change. She sat long enough for the murmur of Vivian's voice and Aldrich's to drift up through the floorboards from the sitting room below, Occasional and meaningless, words without content. Placeholder, that was what she had been. Not a woman, not a choice. A placeholder, something you put in a spot to hold it until the real thing arrives. She thought about all the small moments she had built into something she had called a relationship. The book he had recommended to her in the second month. The way he had remembered, on a cold evening, that she preferred tea without sugar. The afternoon he had sat with her in the garden while she read, and he had not tried to fill the silence because she had once told him she found comfortable silence to be a rare thing, and he had apparently filed that away and used it. She saw now that all of it had been management. Not feeling, not sincerity. Management. He was a man who understood people well enough to give them what they needed in small amounts, keeping them comfortable, keeping them available, keeping them in place. She had been managed for 3 years by a man who had never once considered that she was a full person with a full life that existed beyond his convenience. The rage she felt was clean and specific. It did not make her want to scream or break anything. It made her want to build something. It made her want to take up space in the world in a way she had been quietly talked out of for most of her life, by her father's indifference, by her society's expectations, by her own careful, cautious habit of making herself smaller so that no one would have to work too hard to be around her. She picked up her pen. She opened her notebook. She wrote, "I am not a placeholder. I am not a convenience. I am not here to make it easier for anyone to get where they are actually going." Then she crossed all of that out. Not because it was wrong, but because she did not need to write it down. She already knew it. The writing was just the ceremony of it, and she did not need ceremonies today. What she needed today was action. Small, practical, personal action. She got up from her desk. She went to her wardrobe and looked at the contents for a full minute, which she had not done in a long time, because she had not considered her clothing worth thinking about for a long time. She had spent years dressed for invisible, dressed for adequate, dressed for someone who was not trying to take up space. She pulled out a dress she had bought on an impulse 2 years ago, deep green, well cut, the kind of color that made people look twice, and had never worn because it had seemed too much, too bright, too present. She put it on. She stood in front of the mirror and looked. It was exactly right. She had no idea why she had ever thought it was too much. She wore it to dinner that evening. Her father glanced at it and said nothing. Vivian tilted her head and said, "You look different," with an expression that suggested she was not entirely sure she liked it. Aldrich was not at dinner that evening. Eleanor sat at the table and ate her food and made conversation and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she was actually present in her own life rather than watching it from a polite distance. After dinner, she told her father that she would be making a trip to the village charitable committee the following week, as she had agreed to help reorganize their record-keeping systems. Her father said he supposed that was fine. Vivian said she hoped Eleanor wouldn't make herself too busy to help with the wedding preparations, with a sweetness that was not entirely sweet. Eleanor said she would manage everything. She always did. That night, lying in bed, Eleanor thought about the word placeholder. She turned it over and over the way you turn over something unpleasant to understand its shape. A placeholder, something you use when you don't yet have the real thing. A stand-in, a temporary solution. She thought about the fact that everyone in her life had at some point treated her as temporary. Her father, who had moved on after her mother's death and found a new priority, society, which had made it quietly clear that a woman of 26 who was not yet married was a question that needed answering. Aldrich, who had made her a waiting room while he decided on the actual destination. And then she thought about what it meant to be tired of being temporary, to decide that you were, in fact, the main thing, not a stand-in for someone else's story but the actual story itself. It was, she realized, a very simple decision. It was not dramatic or complicated. It was simply the decision to stop shrinking, to stop making it comfortable for other people to overlook her, to stop organizing everyone else's life as though her own were an afterthought. The question was what to replace it with. She did not yet have an answer, but she had the decision, which was the part that came first. The answer would come because it had to, because decisions like this one, made in the quiet and the dark by women who have run out of patience for being managed, have a way of calling the world toward them. They have a way of shaking something loose, of opening a door that was never visible before, of making a path where the grass had simply been standing still. Eleanor did not believe in fate. She believed in preparation and attention, and the willingness to act when something real appeared in front of you. She believed in knowing yourself well enough that when the moment arrived you would not be caught off guard. She was preparing, she was paying attention, she was ready to act. The world, for its part, was already moving in her direction, though she could not have known this yet. Could not have known that 12 miles away, in a set of private rooms that were not on any public map, a man she had never properly met, was reviewing information about her and coming to a conclusion that would change both their lives. She fell asleep with the light still on, the notebook open on the pillow beside her, the pen in her hand. Outside, the spring night was warm and full of sound, and the world was doing what it always does, moving, shifting, arranging itself into patterns that nobody fully understands until they are already living inside them. The next morning she woke up early, dressed in the green dress again, and went downstairs to help plan a wedding she was no longer afraid of. She was no longer afraid of any of it. And that, as it turned out, was exactly when things began to change. The charitable committee meeting was held on a Tuesday in the back room of the village hall, which always smelled faintly of old paper and candle wax, and the particular mustiness of a building that had been used for important purposes for too many years to count. Eleanor arrived early and found the room already partially occupied by a small group of women and two older gentlemen who handled the financial side of things, none of whom knew quite what to make of her when she set her notebooks on the table and began asking questions. She had been involved with charitable work in a quiet, supportive capacity for years. She had organized, she had donated, she had managed, but she had always done it at the edges, helping when asked, contributing where she could, never positioning herself as someone with authority because authority felt like it needed to be earned through some process she had not yet completed. That Tuesday she walked into the room and sat at the center of the table and asked to see every record they had from the past 4 years, and the surprise on the committee members' faces was something she noted and filed away without comment. What she found in those records was exactly what she had expected: gaps, duplications, funds that had been allocated but not tracked, distributions that had happened without documentation, not corruption, just the honest disorganization of people who cared very much but had never been given proper systems. She spent 3 hours that day and came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, and by the end of the third meeting she had built them a system that could be maintained by one person with moderate attention, and the committee secretary, a woman named Dorothea who had been keeping records in 3 different notebooks for 6 years, looked at Eleanor's clean single ledger and said, "Why didn't anyone do this before?" Eleanor said she did not know. Dorothea shook her head and made Eleanor a cup of tea. Word spread the way word does in small communities. A woman on the next committee over heard about it and asked if Eleanor would come and look at their records. A man who sat on the board of a small agricultural lending association came to Hartwell Manor on a quiet afternoon and knocked politely and asked whether Miss Hartwell might be available to discuss an administrative challenge they were having. Eleanor's father, who happened to be in the hall when this man arrived, looked mildly baffled. He told Eleanor afterward that he hadn't realized she had become so involved in all of that. Eleanor said yes, she had been for some time. He went back to his paper. None of this was fame. None of this was visible in any conventional sense. But it was real, and it was hers. And every time she sat in one of those badly lit back rooms with a stack of disorganized papers and began building order out of them, she felt a satisfaction that she had not felt in any of the drawing rooms, or dinner parties, or social events that had been the official currency of her life. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She just hadn't let herself take up space with it before. Meanwhile, the wedding preparations continued at home. The dress fittings became more frequent. The guest list was refined and refined again. Vivian developed opinions about flowers so specific that the florist sent a note asking whether it might be possible to speak directly with the young lady in question, and Eleanor managed that conversation too. She sat with Vivian while the final fabric for the ceremony was chosen and gave honest opinions when asked for them, and kept her thoughts about everything else entirely to herself. Aldrich came to the house twice a week. He and Eleanor moved around each other with a careful neutrality that was not quite coldness and not quite comfort, the neutrality of two people who have an unspoken agreement to maintain the surface of a thing. He did not say anything further to her about placeholders or intentions or any of the things he had said on the staircase. She did not invite him to. They were polite, they were managed. It was, in its own way, a perfect picture of what the whole 3 years had been. But Eleanor was different now, and she knew it even if no one else did. The difference was not visible in any single thing she said or did. It was in the quality of her attention. She was paying attention forward now, toward what she was building, rather than backward toward what had been taken. She was not walking through her days waiting for someone to notice her. She was noticing herself, which was both simpler and harder than it sounds. On a quiet evening near the end of the 2nd month after the announcement, Catherine came to tea and found Eleanor reading at the window with the curtains half open to catch the last of the light. Catherine sat down. She looked at Eleanor for a while. Then she said, "Something has changed in you." Eleanor put her book down. "Good change or bad change?" "I am not sure yet," Catherine said. "You seem further away, but also more like yourself. It is a strange combination. Eleanor thought about this. I think, she said slowly, that I have been very close to other people's things for a very long time. I have been so close to them that I couldn't see my own. Catherine nodded. She poured herself tea. What are your own things? Eleanor looked at the window, at the evening light coming through, and she told Catherine the truth, about the notebook and the 14 items, about the charitable systems she had been building, about the way it felt to sit in a room full of disorganized papers and make them make sense, about the satisfaction of it, the deep and unglamorous pleasure of building order out of chaos, when the chaos was real, and the order would actually help someone. Catherine listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she said, "That doesn't sound like very little." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It doesn't." "Then why?" Catherine said, setting down her cup with the particular deliberateness of a woman who is about to say something true. "Have you been spending so much energy on other people's lives?" Eleanor did not have an answer to this that wasn't painful. "Because I thought that was what I was for," she said at last. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are going to be very interesting to watch from here on out." Eleanor almost smiled. "I certainly hope so." Outside, the evening was turning into night, and somewhere in the distance a door was about to open that neither of them could see yet. But Eleanor felt it, not with certainty, not with any specific knowledge, but with the particular sensitivity of a person who has recently become very awake to the world, and is therefore noticing things that were always there but previously invisible. She had the feeling, sitting there in the last of the light with her friend and her cold cup of tea, that her life was about to become something she had not planned for. She had the feeling that she was ready. The royal messenger arrived on a morning when the household was in the middle of arguing about centerpieces. Not an argument with raised voices. Nothing in the Hartwell house was ever that direct. It was the kind of argument that happens through silence and implication, where Vivienne would say something about wanting white lilies in tall vases, and their father would nod without listening, and the florist's assistant, who had come to collect a revised order, would look helplessly at Eleanor, who was the only person in the room who understood what the actual problem was, which was that the venue ceiling was too low for tall vases, and the order needed to be changed to shorter arrangements. Eleanor was explaining this for the second time when the front door opened and the housemaid's voice changed. That small, unmistakable change in register that means something unexpected and not entirely ordinary is happening in the entrance hall. She excused herself from the centerpiece conversation and went to the hall. The messenger was young, well-dressed, and clearly well-trained, which meant he was standing very straight and making absolutely no expression whatsoever. He was holding a letter sealed with dark red wax, and the seal pressed into the wax was not a design Eleanor had ever seen up close before, though she recognized it immediately. Everyone in the kingdom would have recognized it. You learned it in childhood without being formally taught, the way you learned certain things that were simply part of the world you lived in. It was the royal seal of King Dorian of Valemore. The messenger asked in a perfectly even voice whether Miss Eleanor Hartwell was at home. Eleanor said, "I am Eleanor Hartwell." He held out the letter. She took it. Her father appeared in the hallway behind her at that moment, having been alerted by the housemaid's change of tone as well. He saw the messenger. He saw the seal. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Vivienne appeared a moment later on the staircase landing above, leaning slightly over the railing in a way she would later deny. Eleanor did not open the letter immediately. She thanked the messenger, who said he would await her reply if a reply was required, and she showed him to the small sitting room off the hall, and asked the housemaid to bring him some water. Then she went to her father's study, which was empty at that moment, which was why she chose it, closed the door behind her, and sat down in her father's chair, which she had never done before, and opened the letter. The letter was brief. That was the first thing she noticed. She had expected something long, layered, full of formal language and official explanation. Instead, it was 2 paragraphs, written in a clear, direct hand. The first paragraph explained that His Majesty's office had become aware of her work with charitable foundations in the surrounding districts, and in particular with her reorganization of record-keeping systems that had resulted in measurably improved distribution of aid to 3 communities in the past quarter. It explained that the Crown maintained an interest in such initiatives and wished to discuss them further. The second paragraph asked whether Miss Hartwell would be willing to attend a meeting at the regional court offices the following week, at a time of her convenience, to speak with a representative from the Royal Administrative Council. It was signed not by the king but by someone with the title of Senior Advisor to the Crown, and the signature was neat and entirely unfamiliar. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she sat for a moment and tried to determine what she was feeling. She was feeling, she decided, several things at once. She was surprised, though not as surprised as she perhaps should have been, because she had known for some time that her work had been noticed by more people than she had originally intended. She was also something she could not quite name, a small, bright alertness, like the feeling of a window opening. She was also, she realized, mildly suspicious. This was not paranoia. It was the reasonable caution of a woman who had spent 3 years being managed by someone she trusted, and who had therefore learned to slow down when something good appeared unexpectedly, and ask what it actually was before she decided how to feel about it. A letter from the royal court was not a threat and not a trick, but she was allowed to wonder what had prompted it, and what exactly was being asked for, and whether there was anything beneath the formal surface of the language that she was not yet seeing. She went back to the hall. She told the messenger that she would be pleased to attend a meeting at the court offices and that the following Thursday would suit her if it suited the council. The messenger said he would convey her response and confirm the appointment within 2 days. He left with the same impeccable neutrality with which he had arrived. Her father, who had been hovering at the edge of the hall the entire time, came forward and asked what the letter said. Eleanor told him, in simple terms, a meeting about charitable work, a representative from the administrative council. He frowned slightly. He said he supposed that was all right. He said she should perhaps take someone with her. She said she would be perfectly fine attending on her own. He frowned a little more at that, but said nothing further, because Vivian called down from upstairs about the centerpiece question, and that redirected his attention entirely. Eleanor went back to the sitting room and resolved the centerpiece problem in under 5 minutes. That evening, after dinner, she sat in her room and thought about the letter. She thought about what it meant that someone in the royal administrative apparatus had been tracking her work closely enough to know the specific numbers. 3 communities, measurably improved past quarter. That was not casual knowledge. That was someone paying attention over time. She tried to reconstruct who might have passed information upward. The committee members, perhaps, or someone on one of the boards she had assisted, or Dorothea with her new clean ledger who may have mentioned Eleanor's name in some context Eleanor did not know about. She could not trace it. It was impossible to trace from where she sat, but it was not, she decided, something to be afraid of. It was something to be interested in. She wrote in her notebook, "Someone has been watching. This is either a problem or an opportunity, possibly both. Attend and find out." As she went to sleep thinking about what she would wear to a meeting at the royal court offices, which was a significantly more pleasant thing to fall asleep thinking about than the color of wedding centerpiece lilies. On Thursday she dressed carefully. Not the green dress, something quieter but equally considered, a deep blue that was serious without being dull. She arranged her own hair, which she did not always bother to do with particular care, and she chose her good coat. She was not dressing to impress. She was dressing to be taken seriously, which was a different thing entirely. The carriage took her to the regional court offices, which were housed in a wide stone building at the eastern edge of the market town, well kept and somewhat imposing in the way of official buildings that are designed to make people feel slightly smaller than they actually are. Eleanor had been to this town many times for committee work and did not find the building intimidating. She had never been inside it before. She was shown immediately to a room on the 2nd floor, not a waiting room, she noticed. She had expected to wait. She was taken straight to the room, which was a study rather than an office, with actual bookshelves and good light, and 2 comfortable chairs set at an angle to each other, rather than across a desk, which was a setup that encouraged conversation rather than interrogation. A man was already in the room, standing at the window when she entered. He turned when she came in, and Eleanor had a moment, brief, manageable, of complete recalibration. This was not the senior advisor. The man standing at the window was perhaps 30, with an ease of bearing that was not arrogance. Something quieter and more settled than arrogance. He was dressed simply for someone who turned out, as Eleanor would only confirm after she had already been in conversation with him for several minutes, to be the King of Valemore. He introduced himself as Dorian, just the one word. He did not use a title. He gestured to one of the chairs, as though this were a perfectly ordinary meeting in a perfectly ordinary room, and Eleanor, who was not going to let a single thing in that room make her feel smaller than she was, sat down with the same steadiness with which she had sat at every committee table in every badly lit back room for the past 2 months, and looked at the king of her country and waited to find out what he actually wanted. He said, "I appreciate you coming." She said, "I was curious." He seemed to find this more satisfying than a formal expression of gratitude would have been. Something shifted in his posture, a small release, a slight settling, as though she had said the right thing without knowing what the right thing was supposed to be. He said, "I want to tell you what I know about you. and I want you to tell me whether what I know is correct." Eleanor said, "That is an unusual way to begin. I find unusual beginnings save a great deal of time." She studied him for a moment. He was direct. He was watching her, as though her response to this statement mattered to him in a way that was not performative. He was not trying to impress her. He was trying to establish, she thought, whether she was who he believed she was. "Then go ahead," she said. He began to speak. He told her about the flood relief. He described it in more detail than she would have expected. The 2 carts, the specific sequence in which she had organized the distribution of supplies, the decision she had made in the 3rd hour to redirect resources from the eastern sector to the northern one when she assessed that the need had shifted. He described how she had managed 3 separate groups of volunteers who didn't know each other and who all had different ideas, and how by midday they were working as a single unit without any of them quite knowing how that had happened. He said, "You did this without being asked, without recognition, without any expectation of receiving either." Eleanor said it needed doing. "Yes," Dorian said, "that is precisely what I found interesting." They talked for 2 hours, not about the flood, and not about the charitable system she had been building, and not at first, about anything that approached the reason she was actually in that room. They talked about the administrative problems she had noticed in the communities she worked with. They talked about what she thought caused them and what she thought might fix them. They talked about the gap between what people needed and what official systems were designed to provide. Dorian asked questions that were specific and well-informed, and Eleanor answered them honestly, and at some point she forgot to maintain the careful social distance that one usually maintained in the company of important people, and simply talked, as she would have talked to Catherine or to Dorothea, as though the conversation mattered, and the person across from her was capable of meeting it. Which he was. That was the unexpected thing. He was entirely capable of meeting it. He pushed back on 2 of her assessments, clearly and without apology, with reasons she had to actually consider, and she changed her position on one of them and held the other, and explained why, and he seemed not even slightly threatened by either of those responses, which in itself told her a great deal about him. At some point a 3rd person entered the room quietly. An advisor, Eleanor assumed, a woman of perhaps 50 with the posture of someone who had been standing just outside doors for a very long time. She set down a tray with tea and left. Dorian poured the tea himself. He remembered, without asking, that Eleanor had mentioned earlier in the conversation preferring it without milk, which told her he listened with the same attention with which he spoke, which was more than she could say for most of the people she had known. She was on her 2nd cup when the quality of the conversation shifted. She felt it before she could identify it. A slight adjustment in the way Dorian was sitting. A pause just a beat longer than the previous ones. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it as honestly as you have answered everything else." She set down her cup. "All right. What do you want?" he said. "Not in this room, not from this meeting, in your life. What is it that you actually want?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. She considered the question. She had not been asked this question, she realized, in so long that she had to spend a moment excavating the answer from underneath everything that had been piled on top of it. The wedding plans and the committee meetings and her father's expectations and Vivienne's needs and 3 years of careful, patient, invisible management of everything and everyone around her. She said, "I want to do work that is real. I want to be in rooms where the decisions that get made actually matter. I want to stop being useful to people's plans and start being—" She paused, and then chose the word carefully. "Central. To something real." Dorian nodded. He did not say that was admirable or impressive or that it was good of her. He said, "I thought so." There was a quiet in the room for a moment. Outside, the sounds of the market town drifted through the window. Carts on stone, distant voices, the ordinary music of an ordinary Thursday that had somehow become something else entirely. Then Dorian said, "I want to speak plainly with you, and then I want you to take whatever time you need to consider what I am about to say before you respond." She waited. He told her, plainly and without ornamentation, that he had been looking for a particular kind of person to stand beside him in his work and in his life. Not a political arrangement, not a social display, but a genuine partner in the things he actually cared about. He told her that he had been watching her, through careful and indirect means, for 6 months. He told her that every piece of information he had collected had confirmed the first impression he had formed on a wet afternoon in a flooded district, watching her move through chaos with the particular confidence of someone who was exactly the right person in exactly the right situation. He said, "I am not asking you for a public spectacle. I am asking you to consider a private agreement, a formal betrothal, sealed and witnessed, kept private until the timing is right. It would not require any immediate change to your circumstances. It would give us both time to be certain. And it would give you, he paused, options, he said, that you do not currently have. Eleanor sat with this for a long moment. She thought about the letter on the morning tray. She thought about the staircase and the word placeholder. She thought about the notebook and the 14 things and the promise she had made to herself in the dark. She thought about the green dress and the committee meetings and Dorothea's face when the new ledger was finished and Catherine saying, "You are going to be very interesting to watch." She thought about Dorian asking what she wanted and listening to the answer the way people listen when they are genuinely interested in what they hear. She did not say yes. Not that day. She said, "I need time to think." He said, "Of course." She said, "How much time can you give me?" He said, "Take a week." She said, "I will need 5 days." He said, "Then 5 days." He was, she noticed, not even slightly surprised that she had reduced the number rather than increased it. She stood up. He stood up. They looked at each other across the pleasant, well-lit room with its good chairs and its tea tray and its shelves of books. And Eleanor Hartwell looked at the King of Valemore and understood that she was standing at a door and that the door was, for the first time in her life, entirely her own to open or close. She said, "I will send word." He said, "I look forward to it." She left the building and walked to where the carriage was waiting and sat inside it, and for the entire drive home she did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window and the autumn fields moving past in the late afternoon light, and she thought. Not about what the world would say, not about what her father would think, or Vivian, or anyone else whose opinions had taken up so much room in her life for so long. She thought about what she had felt in that room, not the surprise of it, not the strangeness of it, but something underneath both of those things, something she had not felt in the presence of another person in a very long time. She had felt like herself, fully and exactly herself. She had not edited anything or managed anything or held anything back because it seemed like too much. She had simply been present and direct and honest, and it had not been a problem. It had been, instead, the whole point. She got home as the household was sitting down to dinner. She apologized for being late. She gave no details about where she had been. Her father accepted the apology and asked if she was hungry. Vivian looked at her with a slight narrowing of the eyes that suggested she was noticing the quality of Eleanor's mood, which was different from most moods, and found it slightly unsettling. Eleanor ate her dinner. She was very calm. She had a great deal to think about, and thinking clearly required a certain stillness, and she had been practicing stillness for most of her life. Later, in her room, she opened her notebook. She did not write anything for a long time. Then she wrote 3 words. "What do I want?" She sat looking at those 3 words. Then, slowly, she began to answer them. Not the public version, not the cautious version, not the version she had been trained to want. The actual answer, the honest, private, undiluted answer about who she was and what she was capable of and what kind of life was worth living. She wrote for a long time. When she finished, she read what she had written. Then she put down the pen and turned off the lamp and lay in the dark and breathed. She already knew what she was going to decide. She had probably known it in the carriage on the way home, watching the fields move past in the fading light. But she had given herself the 5 days because she was a careful person, and because important decisions deserved to be arrived at properly rather than rushed, even when the answer was already clear. She would be certain by the 3rd day. She was, in fact, certain by the next morning. But she waited the full 5 days anyway, because patience was something she was good at, and because she wanted to know, when she gave her answer, that it had been given fully and freely, and not in the breathless excitement of the moment. On the 5th day she sat at her writing desk, picked up her pen, and wrote a very short letter. She folded it, she sealed it, she handed it to the housemaid and gave an address. Then she went downstairs and helped Vivian choose the wording for the wedding invitations, and she did not say a word to anyone, and the household moved around her as it always had, and nobody noticed that anything had changed. Everything had changed. The secret sat inside Eleanor Hartwell like a stone in still water, present, solid, and completely invisible from the surface. She had sent the letter on a cold and clear morning, and by that afternoon the confirmation had arrived. A single folded note, delivered by the same quiet messenger who had brought the first letter, containing only a date, a time, and the words, "We are grateful for your consideration." Eleanor had read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it at the back of her writing desk drawer beneath a copy of her household accounts ledger, which she was reasonably confident no one in the family would ever willingly open. The formal betrothal signing took place 3 days after her confirmation, in a room that was not the court offices but a private set of chambers Eleanor had been escorted to through a side entrance by Dorian's senior advisor, the woman of 50 with the excellent posture, whose name was Meredith, and who was one of the 3 witnesses present that afternoon. The other 2 were men Eleanor did not know and would not see again for some time. The document itself was precise and unambiguous. It bore Dorian's signature and the royal seal. It bore Eleanor's signature, which she wrote carefully and without hesitation. It bore the 3 witness signatures. And then it was placed in a leather folder, and the leather folder was placed in a locked box, and Meredith took the box with her when she left. The whole thing took 40 minutes. Eleanor drove home in a carriage with curtained windows. She sat in the dim interior and felt the weight of what had just happened settle around her. Not heavily, not uncomfortably, but definitively, like a door closing behind her, like the moment after a decision when the decision becomes real. She was engaged to the King of Valemore. Nobody knew. The household was the same household when she returned. Her father was in his study with a newspaper. Vivian was on the garden terrace looking at ribbon samples with the wedding seamstress. The housemaid was carrying fresh linen up the stairs. Everything was exactly as it had always been, and Eleanor walked through it all and went to her room and stood at the window looking out at the garden for a long time, and what she felt was not triumph and not fear, and not the breathless exhilaration she might have expected. She felt ready. That was the truest word for it. She felt like someone who has been preparing for a journey for a very long time, and has finally, quietly, got on the road. The weeks that followed were an education in a particular kind of patience. Eleanor went about her life as she always had, helping with the wedding, managing the charitable work, having tea with Catherine on Tuesdays, passing Aldrich in the corridor when he came to call on Vivian. She did all of it with the same composed attention she always brought to everything, and nobody noticed a difference, which was both useful and, privately, a little funny. Dorian had told her, that afternoon in the signing room, that the timing of the public announcement would be decided together, and that he would not move forward without her agreement. He had said it simply and without elaboration, and the straightforwardness of it had meant more to Eleanor than any amount of formal assurance could have. He was not managing her, he was consulting her. Those were very different things. She had asked him, in one of their careful and infrequent communications during this period, why he had chosen to keep it private rather than announce it immediately. He had written back, in handwriting she was beginning to recognize, that clear and unhurried script, that he wanted her to be certain, and that he wanted the announcement, when it came, to be made at the right moment, and not simply the earliest possible one. He said he had learned that the difference between the right moment and the first available moment was often the difference between something lasting and something that simply happened. She had read that sentence 3 times, and then put the letter in the drawer with the confirmation note. She did not tell Catherine. She had thought about telling Catherine, had reached the point, more than once, of picking up the pen with the intention of writing, "I have something rather large to tell you," but had always stopped. Not because she distrusted Catherine, who was the most trustworthy person she knew, but because keeping the secret entirely to herself was an act of self-discipline that she found she needed. It was proof that she could hold something large and important, and not let it spill out of her, not even to the people she loved. She had spent years managing everyone else's secrets and emotions and needs. This was hers, and she was going to hold it properly. The wedding preparations entered their final month. The invitations had been sent. The guest responses were coming back in a slow but steady trickle, each one representing another person who would be present in that cathedral on the afternoon when Vivian Hartwell stood beside Duke Aldrich Voss and became his wife. Eleanor sorted the responses and updated the seating arrangement 3 times. She confirmed the flowers, the music, the order of the ceremony with the cathedral officiant, a serious older gentleman named Reverend Caldwell who seemed quietly impressed by how organized she was. He told her once, after a long meeting in which they had resolved 3 logistical problems that had come up since his last conversation with the family, that the event was fortunate to have her managing the details. Eleanor thanked him. He said, "I mean it sincerely. Most families arrive at this stage with half the arrangements still up in the air. You have left nothing to chance." Eleanor said she preferred not to leave things to chance if there was a reasonable alternative. He looked at her with the expression of someone who is suddenly seeing a person more clearly than they had before and said, "You are rather remarkable." She said, "I am simply organized." He shook his head slightly and showed her out, and she walked to her carriage thinking about how many times she had redirected compliments in her life by replacing them with smaller, safer descriptions of herself. She had done it for so long she barely noticed anymore. Organized, practical, capable, all true, all smaller than the truth. She was going to stop doing that. She made a note in her book that evening. Stop making yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. This is a habit, not a truth. That same week, during a fitting for Vivian's wedding gown, Eleanor stood in the seamstress's room holding fabric swatches and listening to Vivian discuss the exact angle at which she wanted her veil to fall, and she noticed something she had not noticed before. Vivian was nervous. Not visibly, Vivian was too practiced to show nervousness visibly, but Eleanor knew her sister. She had been watching her sister for 23 years, and underneath the brightness and the certainty and the opinions about veils, something was unsettled. Vivian's hands moved a fraction more quickly than usual. She changed her mind about a detail twice in 10 minutes, which was unlike her. She kept asking the seamstress whether the dress would photograph well, not whether it was beautiful, which was a question about external perception rather than personal feeling, and therefore a question driven by anxiety. Eleanor folded this observation away without comment. She did not know exactly what Vivian was anxious about, and she did not ask. It was possible she was simply feeling the weight of an approaching wedding day, the magnitude of a decision that was now too far along to reconsider, even if reconsideration were something she wanted. It was possible she had noticed something in Aldrich that Eleanor herself had noticed years ago, that quality of careful management, of warmth strategically deployed, that was so effective precisely because it never let you see the mechanism behind it. Or perhaps she was simply nervous in the ordinary way of brides. Eleanor could not know. She held the swatches and said yes, the dress would photograph beautifully, which it would, and the fitting continued. In the evenings she read. She read the books she had always meant to read and had been quietly postponing. She went for walks in the early morning before the household was awake, a habit she had recently started, choosing the longer route through the fields because she liked the quality of the light at that hour, and because the walk gave her time to think without anyone requiring anything of her. She thought about Dorian. She thought about what it meant to share a life with someone, in the full and serious sense of the word, rather than simply occupying the same social space with good manners. She thought about what she knew of him, which was still limited, still partial, still filtered through careful communications and one meeting, and everything she had noticed in the room where they talked. What she knew was that he was direct, he was thoughtful, he was not performing. He asked real questions and listened to real answers. He had chosen her, not her name, not her family, not anything she hadn't earned herself. He had watched her work for 6 months and then made a decision based on who she actually was, without asking for anything she couldn't honestly give. That was, she had come to understand, a rare thing. Rarer than any title or wealth or social position. It was the rare thing she had been waiting for without knowing that was what she was waiting for. She was not going to confuse it for something smaller than it was. 2 weeks before the wedding, she received a longer letter from Dorian than usual. He wrote about the coming weeks. He wrote about the timing of the announcement, which they had been discussing in their communications in careful and general terms. He wrote that he was ready when she was ready, and that the decision was hers to lead. He also wrote one sentence near the end of the letter that she read several times. I realize I have asked you to carry something large, in a situation that was already difficult, and I want you to know that I have not forgotten what it costs. She sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she wrote back. She told him she was ready. She told him she wanted it done at the wedding, not before, not after. At the moment that had been designed, by people who had not thought about Eleanor at all, to be the final picture of her irrelevance, standing at the altar in a bridesmaid's dress, holding flowers for a wedding she had organized from start to finish, beside a man who had called her a placeholder. She wrote, let that be the moment. Let everything change from there. She sealed the letter. She handed it to the housemaid. She went back to sorting the final round of wedding correspondence. 13 days. The reply from Dorian came the following morning. It was the shortest communication she had received from him. 3 words. As you wish. She folded the note. She placed it in the drawer. She went downstairs. The final 2 weeks before the wedding moved with a particular kind of acceleration that Eleanor had noticed before, the way time seems to speed up as something large approaches, as though the universe is rolling events downhill. Deliveries arrived daily. The cathedral was being decorated. The household staff was anxious and busy and slightly overwhelmed in the pleasant way of people whose anxiety comes from a good occasion rather than a bad one. Her father was in excellent spirits. He had received a great many congratulations on the match, which he accepted with the satisfied manner of a man who had made the brilliant strategic decision to sell something he barely owned. He was already referring to Aldrich as my son in conversation, which Aldrich received with the careful warmth of a man who knew the value of managing his wife's family. Eleanor watched this dynamic from across dinner tables and sitting rooms and noted it and said nothing. Vivian, in these final 2 weeks, was partly herself, and partly something Eleanor didn't quite recognize. She was still bright, still charming, still capable of lighting up a room with the sheer force of her attention. But she came to Eleanor's room on a Tuesday evening, 9 days before the wedding, and sat on the edge of the bed in the way she had sat as a small child, with her feet tucked under her, and was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She said, "Are you all right, Ellie?" Eleanor looked up from the book she was reading. "I am fine." "You seem—" Vivian searched for the word. "Far away. You have seemed far away for weeks." Eleanor considered this. She put her book down. She looked at her sister, at the familiar face she had known all her life, the face that had always been brighter and louder and more demanding of the world's attention, and which right now looked, unexpectedly, like someone who was not entirely sure of herself. Eleanor said, "I am not far away. I am just thinking." Vivian said, "About what?" "About what comes next," Eleanor said, which was true, and which conveyed nothing. Vivian was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice, "Are you angry with me?" Eleanor looked at her for a long time. She thought about how to answer this honestly, without causing a scene that would need to be managed for the next 9 days. She thought about what Vivian had done, and what Vivian probably understood about what she had done. She thought about the fact that anger and grief and the complicated tangle of feelings she had been carrying for months were not things that could be resolved in one Tuesday evening conversation. She said, "I am not angry with you, Vivian. I am adjusting to a new picture of things." Vivian seemed to turn this sentence over in her mind. She said, "I did not do it to hurt you." Eleanor said, "I know that." "That doesn't mean it didn't hurt you." Eleanor looked at her sister. She was surprised, more than she expected to be. This was more self-awareness than Vivian typically offered. She said, "No, it doesn't." Vivian nodded. She was quiet for a little while longer. Then she said, "I hope that whatever comes next for you is better than what you were waiting for." Eleanor blinked. She held very still. Then she said, very quietly, "It already is." Vivian looked at her for a moment, trying to read something in her face. Then she smiled. A genuine smile, not the social one, and said, "Good." She unfolded herself from the bed and left the room, and Eleanor listened to her footsteps in the corridor, and then sat in silence for a moment, and felt something in her chest settle, like something that had been at an angle for a long time finding its proper position. She did not know whether her relationship with Vivian would ever be what it had been before. She did not know whether it should be, or whether the before had been honest enough to be worth returning to. But that conversation, small and quiet and conducted without witnesses, was something. It was more than she had expected. She picked up her book. She could not concentrate on it. She put it down again. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark garden and thought about 9 days. She thought about what would happen in 9 days in a cathedral full of people who had been carefully organized into their seats by her own hand. She thought about Dorian, who would send 4 guards ahead and arrive himself in formal dress and stand beside her while the herald read out the document she had signed in that quiet room, and who would look only at her. She thought about how the room would sound when the words were read. She thought about Aldrich's face. She found that she did not particularly care about Aldrich's face. This seemed important. It meant the whole thing was not about him, which meant it was not about revenge, which meant it was simply what it was. Her life, becoming what it was supposed to be, at the moment that happened to be the most inconvenient for a man who had once called her a placeholder. She almost laughed. She did not, because it was late and the house was quiet, and she did not want to explain it to anyone. But the almost laugh was real, and it was warm, and it was hers. 9 days. She closed the curtain and went to bed. Outside, the late spring night was alive with small sounds, a dog somewhere in the distance, wind in the garden hedge, the creak of the old manor settling into itself as the temperature dropped. Eleanor Hartwell slept without difficulty, which was a thing she had been doing more often lately, and which she had started to understand was not a coincidence. It was what happened when you stopped waiting for someone else to decide the shape of your life, and started deciding it yourself. It was what happened when the thing you were carrying was finally, undeniably yours. She slept. The house breathed around her, and 9 days ticked quietly down toward 8. 6 days before the wedding, the cathedral began to smell like flowers. Eleanor knew this because she went there on a Wednesday afternoon to oversee the first stage of the floral arrangements, and when she stepped through the side entrance, she was met immediately by a wave of scent, lilies and white roses and something greener underneath, the smell of fresh-cut stems in water, the smell of a place being dressed for a significant occasion, The head decorator, a competent woman named Harriet who had done 3 other weddings for families of similar standing, was already in conversation with 2 assistants at the far end of the nave, gesturing at the arch above the altar with a critical expression. Eleanor introduced herself. Harriet knew who she was, had been working with her correspondence for 3 weeks, and seemed relieved to see her in person. There was a problem with the arrangement for the south side columns. The vases that had been selected were too narrow for the stems being used, and the result was that the flowers were either too tightly packed to look natural, or, if loosened, tended to lean at an unfortunate angle. They had also run short on the white ribbon, and a substitute had been suggested that Harriet was not happy with. Eleanor looked at the vases. She looked at the flowers. She turned to Harriet and said, "Use wider vessels and go lower. Table height arrangements rather than column mounted. It will open the side aisles and make the whole space feel larger." She looked at the ribbon problem. "The substitute is fine if you pair it with the green you have on hand. The contrast will look intentional." Harriet considered both suggestions for about 30 seconds. Then she said, "Yes, exactly right." She turned to her assistants and began issuing revised instructions. Eleanor walked the length of the cathedral slowly, checking each section against the plan she had in her head, looking for anything else that might need adjustment. The afternoon light came through the high windows and fell in long, pale lines across the stone floor. The cathedral was beautiful in this quiet working state, full of ladders and bundles of ribbon and flower buckets. None of the formality of ceremony yet, just the preparation for it. She had always found this stage of events more interesting than the events themselves, the machinery behind the moment. She stopped at the front of the nave and looked at the altar. She stood there for a moment, alone in that section of the cathedral, with the sound of Harriet directing her assistants at the far end, and the smell of cut flowers filling the space around her. This was where she would stand in 6 days. To the left of the altar, in the bridesmaid's position, in a pale blue dress that Vivian had chosen because it would photograph well against Vivian's white, she would be standing there when Dorian walked in. She considered that fact for a moment. She turned it over quietly. She had been living with the knowledge for weeks now, had become accustomed to carrying it, had stopped being surprised by it in the middle of ordinary conversations, but standing here, in the actual physical space where it would happen, something made it more concrete, more real, in the way that places make things real in a way that thoughts alone cannot. She was standing in the spot where, 6 days from now, a room full of people who had known her entire life were going to have every assumption they had ever made about her rearranged in the space of approximately 3 minutes. She breathed in the flower smell. She looked at the high windows. She felt, very clearly and precisely, that she was not afraid. She went home. She made a final check of the guest seating arrangements. She confirmed the carriage schedule for the wedding morning. She ate dinner with her father and her sister, and a cousin who had arrived early from the countryside, and who spent most of dinner discussing the cousin's own recent travels, which required very little from Eleanor in terms of active participation. Vivian was sparkling at dinner. The closer the wedding came, the more she sparkled, and Eleanor had decided this was Vivian's way of managing the anxiety she had glimpsed. She turned her energy up rather than down, became more present and vivid rather than withdrawing, which was both effective and slightly exhausting for everyone around her. Aldrich, seated beside her, watched her with the particular expression Eleanor had learned to read as appreciation that was also containment. He found her brightness pleasing in the way one finds a well-managed garden pleasing, ordered and pleasant and not requiring anything difficult from the observer. Eleanor ate her food. She made the appropriate responses when spoken to. She watched the table with the clear, quiet eyes of someone who has decided she is at the end of something and the beginning of something else, and is simply moving through the in-between. After dinner, she went upstairs. She sat at her desk. She opened the drawer and took out Dorian's communications, all of them, and read them in order from first to last. She did this not out of sentiment but out of deliberateness. She wanted to hold the full shape of it in her mind, to know it thoroughly from start to finish, to be certain there was nothing she had not considered. She finished reading and sat for a moment. Then she folded the letters, tied them together with a piece of plain ribbon she cut from her sewing box, and put them back in the drawer. She locked the drawer with the small key she kept on a ribbon around her neck, under her collar, where no one could see it. She thought about what Dorian had written in his most recent letter, which had arrived 2 days ago. He had written practical information, the time of arrival, the number of guards who would precede him, the exact wording of the herald's declaration, which had been agreed upon with the witnesses from the signing, and would be read in full. He had also written, at the end, something that was not practical information. He had written, "I want you to know that whatever you feel in that room, whatever the room does around you, I will be looking only at you." She had read that sentence 4 times the day it arrived. She was not a person who was easily moved by words. She had seen too many words used as instruments to trust them entirely, to let them do too much work in her heart before her head had evaluated them carefully. But she trusted those words. She trusted them because they were consistent with everything she knew of him. Not a performance, not a management of her feelings, just a true thing, said plainly by someone who meant it. She turned off the lamp. She sat in the dark for a little while. Then she went to bed and slept 7 hours without interruption, which was the most she had slept in a single stretch in months. The next 4 days moved in their accelerating way. The household became a different kind of busy, the kind that felt closer to controlled chaos than organized preparation, the kind that happens when an event is so close that there is no longer time to fix large things, only to manage what is already in motion. Eleanor managed it. Of course she did. She was the one who had built the systems, and she was the one who kept them running. And by the time the evening before the wedding arrived and the last confirmations were made and the last details settled, she had the satisfaction of knowing that everything that could be prepared had been prepared. She sat on the edge of her bed that night, the night before, and she allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to feel the full weight of what was coming. Not anxiously, not in the frantic way of someone who is not prepared, just fully. She let it be large and present and real. Tomorrow was going to change her life. It was going to change a great many other people's lives too, in ways they had not anticipated and could not have prepared for, because the change was coming from a direction they had never thought to watch. She thought of Vivian, asleep or perhaps not sleeping in the room down the hall, on the night before her wedding, to a man who had once called Eleanor a placeholder while standing on a staircase landing with dried lavender on the table behind him. She thought of her father, already mentally composing the telling of this story for his club, the story of the daughter who had done well, which was already Vivian's story in his mind, and would continue to be Vivian's story for him, whatever happened tomorrow, because some people are simply not available to be surprised by the people they have underestimated. She thought of Catherine, who would be in the cathedral tomorrow with her husband, sitting in the row Eleanor had assigned her. Catherine, who had told her she was going to be very interesting to watch. Eleanor smiled in the dark of her room. She could not wait to see Catherine's face. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She took 3 slow, deliberate breaths, not because she was afraid, but because it was the end of one thing and the beginning of another, and that deserved a moment of acknowledgement even in private. She whispered to herself, in the dark, "You are ready." Then she closed her eyes. In the morning, everything would begin. The morning of the wedding came in through Eleanor's window as a stripe of pale gold across the floor. She was already awake when it arrived. She had been awake for perhaps 20 minutes, lying still and thinking in the pleasant, unhurried way of someone who does not need to rush because everything has already been arranged. She had learned, over the past weeks, to distinguish between the kind of wakefulness that comes from anxiety, the middle-of-the-night kind, with its edges of dread, and the kind that comes from anticipation. This was the second kind, clean and bright and looking forward. She dressed herself without assistance. The housemaid knocked at 7, and Eleanor told her kindly that she was managing on her own, and would come down for breakfast when she was ready. She took her time. She chose what she would wear for the morning. There would be time to change into the bridesmaid dress at the cathedral, with the care of someone who knew that how she presented herself in the next several hours mattered, and also with the freedom of someone who no longer allowed other people's opinions of her presentation to be the primary measure of it. She looked at herself in the mirror before she left the room. She looked for the woman she had been 6 months ago, the one who had found a letter on a tray and gone quietly to the kitchen, and not cried, and promised herself she was done waiting. She could still find her, that woman. She was still there, but she was different now, not replaced, built forward from, the way a house can be added to without the original rooms being lost. She went downstairs. Breakfast was its own small theater. Vivienne was present in a dressing gown with her hair already pinned by the maid who had been brought in for the occasion, and she was eating half a slice of toast with the concentrated expression of someone performing normalcy while feeling everything but. Her father was present in his good suit, already dressed, already mentally at the reception. He was in excellent spirits. He talked about the weather, which was clear, and about the guest list, and about what a handsome couple they would make, and Eleanor ate her eggs and nodded at the appropriate moments. At 9 o'clock the carriages arrived. Vivian went with her father and the maid. Eleanor went separately, in the smaller carriage, carrying the small bag she had packed the night before with everything she would need for the ceremony. The drive took 22 minutes. She spent most of it looking at the fields and the morning sky and thinking about nothing in particular, which was exactly what she needed to be doing. The cathedral was transformed. The floral arrangements she had approved on Wednesday were completed and in place, and the effect was better than she had anticipated. The lower arrangements along the south columns opened the space exactly as she had hoped, and the ribbon was right, the contrast working the way she had said it would when Harriet had been uncertain. The candles were lit. The light through the high windows fell across the stone floor in the same long pale lines she had noticed during the week, but more golden now, more ceremonial. The cathedral staff was moving quietly through the space with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times, and found it both routine and meaningful at once. Eleanor changed into the bridesmaid dress in the small room set aside for the purpose, pale blue, as Vivian had chosen. It was, she reflected, a perfectly good dress. She looked at herself in the small mirror and thought, the last time I will wear a color chosen by someone else for someone else's occasion. Then she straightened her shoulders and went out. The guests were beginning to arrive. Eleanor stood near the entrance for a while and directed people toward their seats with the calm authority of someone who knows the plan in detail and trusts it completely. She recognized almost everyone, people her family had known for years, people from the surrounding society who had watched her grow up as Lord Hartwell's quieter daughter. They greeted her warmly. Several of them said she had done a wonderful job with the arrangements. She thanked them. She showed them to their rows. She was gracious and composed and entirely present. She found Catherine. Catherine was standing near the center aisle with her husband, who was a quiet man named Philip who had the good sense to understand when a conversation between two women did not require him. Catherine looked at Eleanor in the bridesmaid dress, and then at Eleanor's face, and then back at the dress. And Eleanor could see her friend trying to calibrate, trying to understand the quality of Eleanor's composure, whether it was the held-together kind or the actually fine kind. Eleanor gave her a small, private smile that was unlike the smile she had been giving everyone else all morning. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, just slightly. She looked at Eleanor for another moment, and then she said, under her breath and very quietly, "You know something." Eleanor said, even more quietly, "Go sit down, Catherine. Pay attention." Catherine stared at her for one more second. Then Philip guided her gently toward their row and she went, looking back once, and Eleanor turned to receive the next arriving guests with her organized, gracious smile. The cathedral filled. The music began. Reverend Caldwell positioned himself at the altar with the gravity of a man who took his work seriously. The processional arrangement that Eleanor had planned with 3 weeks of correspondence began to unfold exactly as she had arranged it. The ushers, the minor attendants, the careful choreography of a ceremony that looked effortless because someone had spent a very long time making it so. Vivian entered on their father's arm. Eleanor was already at the front of the nave, in her position, and she turned with everyone else when the music changed. And even with everything she knew, even with the full knowledge of what was coming and when, she felt something real and quiet when she saw her sister. Vivienne was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they are walking into a moment that is genuinely theirs, whatever its complications. The dress was perfect. The veil fell exactly as she had wanted. She was luminous in the way of bright, complicated people on the biggest days of their lives. Eleanor watched her come and felt no bitterness and no grief. What she felt, to her own slight surprise, was something gentle, something that wished Vivian well without condition. She hoped Vivian would be happy. She genuinely hoped it. She hoped Aldrich was better to her in private than he had been in general. She hoped that whatever had made Vivian nervous in the final weeks would resolve itself, and that the life she had chosen would be sufficient to her. But Eleanor was not going to stand at the altar and watch her sister marry into the life that had been constructed partly at Eleanor's expense, and feel only gentle things. She was also going to stand there and know, privately, solidly, with complete certainty, that her own life was already something Vivian had not accounted for, that the woman in the pale blue dress, holding flowers, positioned as the gracious second, was already none of those things. She was the first. She was just the only one who knew it yet. She watched Vivian reach the altar. She watched Aldrich turn toward his bride with his carefully managed expression of controlled warmth. She heard Reverend Caldwell begin to speak, his measured voice filling the cathedral with the words she had heard at a dozen weddings in her life, the old words that still had weight when they were meant. And she waited. She was very good at waiting. She had been practicing it for years. But she would not be waiting much longer. The cathedral doors were closed. The ceremony had begun. Outside, 4 royal guards were already on their way. The vows had barely begun when the cathedral doors opened. Not with violence. Not with the crash of wood against stone that stories sometimes describe. They opened with a controlled, deliberate force that carried its own kind of authority. The authority of 4 men in royal uniform who were not asking permission and were not, by any measure, uncertain of their purpose. The sound stopped the ceremony. Not immediately, not in a single instant, but in the way that something inevitable slows a moving thing. A ripple through the congregation. A stiffening, a series of heads turning, a silence spreading from the back of the cathedral toward the front like water moving uphill somehow, against what should have been possible. Reverend Caldwell stopped speaking mid-sentence. He looked past the congregation toward the doors. The expression on his face went through several stages in quick succession: surprise, then recognition, then a very particular stillness that was the expression of a man who understands that he is witnessing something that will be talked about for the rest of his professional life, and possibly beyond it. Aldrich turned. Vivian turned. The two of them stood at the altar and turned toward the back of the cathedral, and for a moment they were simply two people who did not yet understand what was happening, which was exactly the same position as everyone else in the room. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She stood in her position with the flowers in her hands and breathed, one slow, deliberate breath, and then she looked. The 4 guards had taken their positions inside the doors, 2 on each side. Behind them, the herald stood with his back straight and a document in his hand, and behind the herald, stepping through the cathedral entrance with the ease of someone who had decided exactly what he was doing and had no remaining doubt about it, was King Dorian. He was dressed formally, not in the careful civilian understatement he had worn to the court offices meeting where Eleanor had first sat across from him. This was the full, unambiguous formality of a man in his public capacity, in clothes that announced what he was before anyone had said a word. There was nothing aggressive in it, nothing theatrical. It was simply clear. It was simply true. The congregation had gone so completely silent that Eleanor could hear the candles. Dorian walked the length of the center aisle. He did not look at Vivian. He did not look at Aldrich. He did not look at the altar or the reverend or the elaborate floral arrangements that Eleanor had spent 3 weeks organizing. He walked the length of that aisle with his gaze fixed on one person, and that person was Eleanor, standing to the left of the altar in a pale blue dress with flowers in her hands, and she looked back at him with the same steadiness she had brought to every room she had ever walked into. He stopped beside her. The herald moved forward. The document, which Eleanor had signed in that quiet room with 3 witnesses and Meredith's steady posture and the locked leather box, was in the herald's hands. The herald unfolded it. He cleared his throat, not from nerves but from professionalism, the preparation of a man about to speak formally in a space that demanded formality. He said, in a voice that was trained to carry clearly to the back of a large room, "By the authority of the Crown of Valemore, and by the witnessed and sealed agreement of His Majesty King Dorian, the following is hereby made public declaration." He read the document. He read all of it. He did not rush. He read the date of the signing. He read the names of the witnesses. He read the formal language of the betrothal agreement, and then he read the clause that named Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of Lord Gerald Hartwell, as the chosen and formally agreed bride of King Dorian of Valemore, by private agreement, now brought into public record by royal decree. He lowered the document. The cathedral absorbed this in complete silence for perhaps 4 seconds. Then it erupted. Not in noise, precisely, in the kind of collective intake that happens when a large group of people are all surprised at the same moment. The movement, the rustling, the turning to neighbors, the sudden high murmur of dozens of conversations beginning at once. Eleanor felt it like a wave. She held herself completely still and let it pass around her, and waited for it to settle. She looked at Dorian. He was looking at her. He had said he would look only at her, and he did. Whatever was happening in the room around them, whatever faces were changing, whatever calculations were being made and remade in the minds of the people sitting in the carefully arranged rows, he was simply looking at her with the expression of someone who was exactly where they decided to be. She thought, in that moment, of the staircase landing, of dried lavender on a small table, of a man who had looked at her with the cold clarity of someone delivering a practical fact and said you were always the placeholder. She was not a placeholder. She had never been a placeholder. Aldrich had not moved since the herald began to read. Eleanor allowed herself one careful glance at him. He was standing at the altar with his hand loosely at his side, and an expression on his face that she could only describe, privately and without cruelty, as a man reconsidering the architecture of a structure he had assumed was solid. He looked at the document. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Dorian. His face moved through confusion and then something else. Something that might have been a form of shame if he were capable of it, or perhaps only the nearest approximation. Vivian. Eleanor made herself look at Vivian. Vivian was holding her bouquet and standing absolutely still, which was the most out-of-character thing Eleanor had seen in 23 years of watching her. The bouquet was in both hands, held at her waist, and she was looking at Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor could not read at all. Not anger, not vindication, not any of the things Eleanor had privately imagined she might see. It was something more complex. something that held surprise and acknowledgement, and perhaps the beginning of an emotion that would take Vivian considerable time to sort out privately. Eleanor looked at Vivian for one moment. She did not look away first. Vivian did. Reverend Caldwell had apparently decided, with the practiced judgment of a man who has managed many difficult moments in a cathedral, that this was a situation in which he should not attempt to resume speaking. He was standing at his position and watching with the expression of someone who is witnessing history and is acutely aware of it. Dorian offered Eleanor his arm. She took it, not dramatically, not with a gesture designed for the room. She shifted the flowers slightly in her left hand and placed her right hand on his arm, and they stood together, side by side, in the cathedral that Eleanor had organized, from the first florist's consultation to the final carriage schedule, and the room full of people who had known her as a younger sister, a useful background presence, a woman who had been passed over, looked at her with the entirely rearranged vision of people who are rapidly updating information they had believed was settled. Lord Gerald Hartwell made a sound. It was not possible to categorize it precisely from where Eleanor stood, but she heard it, a sound that contained surprise and recalculation, and perhaps the first faint stirring of what he would eventually, in private, understand was pride, though he had not earned the right to feel it yet, and wouldn't for some time. Catherine, seated in the center section with her husband Philip, was completely still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking at Eleanor with an expression that was entirely private and entirely clear, and that Eleanor, catching it for just a moment across the distance of the nave, understood perfectly. It was the expression of someone saying, "I knew it." Not the outcome. Catherine had not known the outcome, but the direction of it, the quality of the person. Catherine had said Eleanor was going to be very interesting to watch, and she had been correct, and the look on her face was not triumph but something quieter and warmer, the satisfaction of a friend who was genuinely glad. Eleanor held on to that, in the midst of everything else. The herald stepped forward again and said, in the same clear and trained voice, that given the public confirmation of the royal betrothal, the formal wedding ceremony would need to be suspended pending consultation with the proper civil authorities, and that all guests were thanked for their attendance. He said this without judgment and without apology, with the professional neutrality of someone who had been prepared for exactly this. What happened next in the cathedral was not chaos, precisely. It was the controlled disruption of a large group of people who had arrived expecting one thing, and were now required to process quite another. They began to move. They talked to each other. They moved toward the exits in the meandering way of people who want to leave and also want to know what is being said by the people near them, in case any of those people have access to more information. Aldrich spoke first, out of everyone in the front of the cathedral. He said, not loudly, not to the room, but to Eleanor directly, and his voice was very controlled. "I did not expect this." Eleanor looked at him. She felt nothing hostile. She felt, very precisely and very cleanly, the absence of the thing she had once felt for him, which was its own kind of information. She said, "I know." She did not add anything to that. She did not need to. Dorian heard this exchange, though he did not respond to it. Eleanor felt his hand shift slightly beneath hers, a small, unmistakable signal that he was aware of her. They walked together toward the side entrance, through the dissolving ceremony, through the rearranging world, through the cathedral that smelled of flowers she had chosen, and candles she had ordered, and orders she had built from nothing. They walked through all of it, and the doors opened before them, and the morning light outside was exactly what it had been, clear, warm, indifferent to the particular dramas of people who had gathered inside to witness a wedding that had become something else entirely. Eleanor stepped through the doors into the light. She was no longer a bridesmaid. She was no longer a placeholder. She was no longer the woman holding other people's flowers at the altar of other people's occasions. She was the woman who was about to become a queen, and she walked into the morning as though this were simply the next thing, the next true and decided thing in a life that had finally, properly, become hers. Outside the cathedral, the morning was doing its ordinary business without apology. The sky was clear. The air carried the smell of the late spring hedgerows and the stone of the old churchyard walls. The carriages that had brought the guests were arranged along the lane, their drivers sitting in various postures of professional patience, none of them yet aware that the event they had been hired to transport people to had become something entirely different from what it was designed to be. Eleanor and Dorian stood outside the side entrance for a moment. Meredith was already there. She had a talent for being where she needed to be before anyone had to find her. 2 of the royal guards had followed them out. The cathedral behind them was still audibly full of people processing what had happened, that low murmur of collective recalibration. Dorian turned to Eleanor. He said quietly, not to anyone but her, "How are you?" Eleanor considered this question. She inventoried herself, body, mind, the quality of what she was feeling right now in this specific moment, and found something she had not anticipated. She realized, light. Not giddy, not unsteady, not the fragile lightness of relief after prolonged fear, simply light, as though something heavy had been put down after a long carry, and her shoulders had not yet caught up to the absence of it. She said, "I am well, better than well." He nodded. He believed her. She could see. He was not checking her answer against what he expected to see. He was simply receiving it. He said, "We should move. There will be a great deal of attention shortly." Eleanor almost laughed. There will be a great deal of attention immediately. He did smile at that. It was a genuine smile, the kind that arrived without being planned, and it changed his face in a way she had only seen in private, in the court officer's room, during their long conversation, when she had said something that reached through the formal surface of the meeting. She filed the smile away as something she was glad to have seen. They moved. The carriages, not the guest carriages but the unmarked royal ones that had been arranged on the far side of the churchyard wall, were waiting. Eleanor got in. Dorian got in beside her. Meredith took the carriage behind. The door closed and the carriage moved, and behind them the church lane and the old stone walls and the sound of a congregation debating the morning's events faded into distance. In the carriage, the two of them were quiet for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of two people who had done something together and were now sitting with what it had produced, which was substantial. Eleanor looked out the window at the passing countryside and thought about the moment when Dorian had offered his arm and she had taken it. She had moved without hesitation. She had not performed the absence of hesitation. She had simply not hesitated. And that, she thought, was the truest thing she could take from the morning. Not the look on Aldrich's face or the silence of the congregation, or even the herald's clear voice reading the document she had signed in a private room weeks ago. The truest thing was that when the moment arrived, she had not been afraid of it. She had simply been there, fully and entirely, and had moved through it as herself. Dorian said, without looking away from the window on his side, "The announcement will be in the papers tomorrow morning." Eleanor said, "I know. There will be a tension of the kind that is less manageable than what just happened in the cathedral. I know that too." He turned to look at her. "Are you ready for it?" She thought about this. Not quickly, but in the deliberate way she had learned to think about things that deserved thought. She thought about her father and what he would say when the initial shock wore off. She thought about Vivian and what would happen to Vivian's wedding now that it had been disrupted and would need to be reconvened in less dramatic circumstances. She thought about the society around her, the people who would need to rapidly revise their understanding of who Eleanor Hartwell was and what she represented. She thought about the wider world beyond that society, which knew nothing about her yet, which was about to begin forming impressions. She said, "I have been managing complexity for other people for most of my life. I think I can manage it for myself." Dorian looked at her for a moment longer. "Yes," he said, "I believe you can." The carriage moved on. The countryside outside was pleasant and still, and unaware of itself. Eleanor rode through it toward whatever came next. What came next, in the immediate sense, was a suite of rooms at the regional governor's residence, arranged by Meredith, who had prepared for multiple outcomes, where Eleanor would be accommodated for the next 2 days while the public announcement was managed and the next steps in the formal process were organized. It was not lavish. It was practical, which suited Eleanor considerably better than lavish would have. She was shown to her rooms by a quiet young man on the governor's staff, who had clearly been instructed to be helpful without being curious, and who managed both with impressive efficiency. The rooms looked out over a small formal garden, the kind that is maintained by someone who loves geometry. Eleanor set her bag down on the chair, looked out the window at the neat hedges and gravel paths, and felt the particular quiet of a room that is entirely hers. She sat down in one of the chairs by the window. She sat in it for a long time without doing anything. This was not wasted time. This was the time you need to feel the full shape of something after it has happened, when the doing of it is over and the only thing left is the knowing of it. She let herself know it. She let it be real and large and present. She let herself understand that the world she would be navigating from this point forward was fundamentally different from the world she had been navigating when she woke up this morning in her room at Hartwell Manor. She thought about Dorothea and the clean ledger. She thought about the committee meetings in their badly lit rooms. She thought about Catherine saying, "You are going to be very interesting to watch." She thought about the 14 items in her notebook, the ones she had been quietly postponing. She thought about the wet afternoon in the flooded district, driving out with 2 carts of supplies because it needed doing and she knew how. She thought about all of it as the connected thread it was, the long, unannounced preparation of a life that had been building towards something that nobody, including herself, had known to look for. A knock at the door. Meredith entered without waiting, which was consistent with her manner. She set a tray on the side table, tea, a plate of food, and a small folded note. She said, "His Majesty asks whether you need anything further before this evening." Eleanor looked at the tray. She realized she had not eaten since the half-breakfast of the wedding morning. She said, "Tell him I have everything I need." Meredith nodded. She paused at the door. She said, in a tone that was still professional, but not quite only professional, "You were very composed this morning." Eleanor said, "Thank you." Meredith said, "It is not a simple thing to stand in that kind of moment and remain yourself." Eleanor looked at her. She said, "I have had practice." Meredith seemed to understand what she meant by that. She gave a small nod, the nod of someone who has seen many things and can recognize when one person is telling another person a true thing without elaborating. Then she left. Eleanor poured herself tea. She unfolded the note from Dorian. It contained 3 sentences. He wrote that she had been extraordinary. He wrote that there was no pressure on her time or movement for the rest of the day, and that she should rest. And he wrote, at the bottom, in the same clear, unhurried hand, "When you are ready to begin, we will begin together." She read those last 7 words 3 times. Then she folded the note, put it in her pocket instead of her bag, closer, and drank her tea, and looked at the formal garden and began, quietly and without ceremony, to think about what she wanted to build. The day moved toward evening. Outside, the world was already changing in ways that would not fully be visible until morning. The papers would have the story tonight and would publish it in the early hours. By breakfast, everyone who had been at that cathedral, and everyone who knew anyone who had been at that cathedral, would have read it or heard it. By midday it would be known in the city. By the end of the week it would be known everywhere. Eleanor Hartwell of Hartwell Manor, overlooked daughter of a minor lord, chief bridesmaid at her sister's wedding to the man who had discarded her, was going to be the Queen of Valemore. She sat in her comfortable chair and the evening light came through the window and she was not afraid, and she was not overcome, and she was not anything other than exactly who she had decided to be, which was the most powerful thing she had discovered in all of the difficult months that had delivered her here. The garden below was perfectly still. A bird landed on the geometric hedge and then left. Eleanor watched it go. She was ready. The papers arrived in the morning like a second ceremony, louder, wider, and lasting far longer than the first. Eleanor had been awake before the copies were delivered to the governor's residence, sitting with her tea by the garden window in the gray pre-dawn light, feeling the peculiar stillness of a morning that you know will not stay still. When the papers came, Meredith brought them herself. 3 different publications, the major ones, all of which had moved quickly, and some of which had clearly pulled their regular front pages overnight to accommodate the story. Eleanor read them at the side table, methodically, without skipping to the parts that felt most personal. The coverage was thorough, the facts were correct, the document, the signing, the witnesses, the declaration at the cathedral, the names of all parties involved. Several papers had managed to locate sources who had been present at the cathedral, and were willing to speak about what they had seen. The descriptions of the moment were varied in their language but consistent in their content. She read herself described as composed and poised, and, in one paper, as an entirely unexpected choice, which was honest at least. She put the papers down when she had finished all 3. She sat for a moment. She was not surprised by the coverage. She had understood that the announcement would be significant and public and discussed at length by people who did not know her and were therefore free to form their impressions without the interference of actual knowledge. She had not expected to enjoy the experience of being the subject of public analysis, and she found that she did not, particularly. It was not unpleasant in the way she might have feared, but it was strange. Being written about with certainty by people who had never sat in the same room as you was a particular kind of strangeness. They were writing about a version of Eleanor Hartwell that was composed from reported details and a few descriptions, and a great deal of inference, and that version was not wrong exactly, but it was flat in the way that all descriptions of real people are flat. It lacked the texture of the actual person. She supposed that was simply what public life would be, a flat version of yourself, moving through the world slightly ahead of the real one. She could manage that. She had been managing things for a long time. By mid-morning, a message arrived from her father. She had expected it. She had not been certain what form it would take. Lord Gerald Hartwell was not a man who made many unexpected moves, but the situation he was currently in was genuinely unprecedented in his experience, and she was curious to see what he would produce under genuine pressure. What he produced was a letter that she read once through and then put aside. It opened with an expression of surprise, which was honest. It moved through a paragraph of formal congratulation, that did not feel entirely false but did not feel entirely warm either. It reached its real point in the third paragraph, where he wrote that he hoped she understood what a significant responsibility she was taking on, and that he trusted she had considered carefully before agreeing to such an arrangement. He wrote that he was glad she had not been left without prospects, which was phrased with the particular obliviousness of someone who had not yet understood that the word prospects was exactly the problem. He closed with an expression of family pride that arrived too late and too carefully worded to be fully believed. She noted that he had not said he was sorry for anything. She noted that he had not referenced Aldrich or Vivienne, or the 3 years of courtship or any of the context that surrounded the morning's events. He had treated the announcement as a standalone fact, dropped into existence without the history that had produced it, which told her everything she needed to know about how he was going to process it from here. She wrote him a brief reply. She told him she was well. She told him she would be in touch when things were settled. She did not invite him to visit or suggest a meeting. She sealed the letter and gave it to Meredith, and then she went and looked out the garden window for a while and thought about what it meant to love a parent who had never quite known how to see you. She thought about it carefully and without drama, the way she thought about most things. She had spent years wanting her father's attention and learning to live without it, and sometimes confusing those two things with each other. She did not hate him. She did not resent him in the consuming way that resentment could become. He was simply a man who had not seen her clearly, and she had spent a long time letting that define the edges of her life. And now she was not going to do that anymore. She could love him from a distance that was honest. She could maintain the relationship without letting his limitations become her own. She could, in other words, do for herself what she had spent years doing for everyone else. Manage the complexity of a person with patience and without illusion. She stepped back from the window. She had work to do. Dorian had arranged for a working meeting that afternoon. Not formal, not full of ceremony, simply practical. The two of them, Meredith, and a civil advisor named Edmund who handled the administrative side of royal matters, sitting at a plain table with documents and tea, and the immediate questions of what needed to happen next. Eleanor attended it with the same attention she brought to committee meetings, with her notebook and her willingness to ask questions that were more specific than comfortable. There were timelines to establish. The formal public announcement, the official one from the Crown, beyond what the papers had reported, needed to be made within the week. There were legal processes that followed from the betrothal document, paperwork that needed to go through proper channels, verifications to be completed. There was also the question of where Eleanor would be and under what circumstances while all of this was being organized. She was at present in a governor's guest suite, which was appropriate for a few days but not a permanent arrangement. Dorian presented the options. Eleanor listened to all of them before responding to any of them, which earned a brief glance from Edmund that she interpreted as approval from someone who had sat through many meetings where people responded to things before listening. She asked 3 questions. She made 2 suggestions. One of them was immediately incorporated. The other was debated for a few minutes and then also incorporated, slightly modified. Edmund made notes. At one point Dorian looked at her across the table and she had the impression he was thinking something he did not say. She noted it and moved on. She would ask him about it later, when they were not in a meeting. She asked about Meredith's role in the formal process. She asked what the expected timeline was for the public ceremony, and whether there was flexibility in it, and what determined the flexibility. She asked what she was expected to learn and from whom and how that was usually organized for people in her position, which was a question that Edmund clearly did not expect because he paused before answering it, though he did have an answer. She wrote things in her notebook. She was not writing to look organized. She was writing because she was organizing, genuinely and in real time, and the notebook was where she put things that needed to be remembered. She had done this at every committee table she had ever sat at. She saw no reason to stop because the stakes had changed. After the meeting, Dorian walked with her through the governor's formal garden, which was the kind of garden that looked better from above than from within but was pleasant enough to walk through on a mild afternoon. They walked without particular direction, on the gravel paths between the geometric hedges, and it was the first time they had been in something resembling an ordinary situation together, not a formal meeting, not a ceremony, not an encounter surrounded by implication. He said, "You were very comfortable in there." She said, "I find the practical side of things comfortable." He said, "So do I." A pause. "It is one of the things the role makes difficult. There is always a layer of ceremony over the practical side, and people sometimes confuse the ceremony with the substance." Eleanor thought about this. She said, "Is that why you went to the flood district without announcement?" He glanced at her. "You worked that out. You knew too much about what I had done that afternoon for it to have been reported secondhand. The details were too specific. You were there." He nodded. "I was traveling. Informally. 2 advisors with me. We heard about the flooding and went to see what was being managed. We stayed long enough to understand the situation." He paused. "Long enough to see you." She looked at him. "What exactly did you see?" He took a moment to answer, and she appreciated that he took it, that he did not produce a quick, comfortable response but found the real one. He said, "Someone who could see the full picture of a complicated situation and act on it calmly, without waiting for permission or recognition. Someone who was not performing competence. Someone who was simply competent, genuinely." Eleanor said, "That is a reasonable description of the flood management." He said, "It was also a description of everything I was looking for in a person to stand beside me." She walked in silence for a moment. She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately by someone who had not known you, to be looked at for 11 hours on a difficult afternoon and understood correctly, without the distortion of social history or family expectation, or any of the frameworks that had prevented the people who had known her for decades from seeing her clearly. She said, "It is strange to be known by someone who was a stranger." He said, "Yes." A pause, perhaps less strange than being unknown by people who were not strangers. She looked at him. He was right, and the rightness of it landed somewhere specific and true. They walked the length of the garden and turned back. The afternoon was warm. The geometric hedges cast neat shadows on the gravel. She thought about the 14 items in her notebook, the ones she had been postponing. She thought about Dorian saying, "When you are ready to begin, we will begin together." She said, "I want to talk to you about the charitable infrastructure, not today, when we have the right meeting for it. But I have been building something in the smaller systems, and I believe there is a version of it that could be scaled." He said, "I want to hear it. Arrange the meeting with Edmund." She said, "I will." They reached the door back into the residence. He held it for her, not as a performance of manners but simply as a reflex, the natural movement of someone who was thinking about the conversation, rather than thinking about how he was appearing in it. She walked in. He followed. Inside, the corridor was quiet. Meredith was visible at the far end, looking at papers. Somewhere in the house there were voices, ordinary administrative voices, the sound of a place doing its daily work. Eleanor stopped at the door to her corridor. She said, "I meant what I said to Edmund, about the timeline." He said, "I know." She said, "And I meant what I said to you, about beginning." He said, "I know that too." They looked at each other for a moment in the corridor. 2 people who had arrived here from completely different directions, through completely different histories, and had nonetheless ended up in the same place at the same time, with the same orientation toward what came next. Eleanor said, "Good." She went to her rooms. She opened her notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote, at the top in her careful and even hand, "What to build." Then she began to write beneath it, and she wrote for a long time, and the afternoon light moved across the wall as she did, and when she put the pen down the page was full, and she had not lost the thread once. This was, she thought, what it felt like when you were doing the right thing. 2 days after the cathedral, Catherine came. Eleanor had written to her, a short note, sent through proper channels, which felt strange given that she and Catherine usually communicated in the casual shorthand of 2 women who had been friends long enough not to need formality. But the note had been necessary, and Catherine had clearly understood this, because she arrived at the governor's residence at the agreed time in her good coat with her steady face and her complete absence of performance, which Eleanor had never valued more than she did at this particular moment. They were given a sitting room. A tray was brought. The staff member who showed them in closed the door discreetly. Eleanor and Catherine sat facing each other in the comfortable chairs, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Catherine said, "I knew something was happening." Eleanor said, "I know you did. I saw your face in the cathedral." Catherine said, "Your face was—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Settled," she said finally. "You looked like someone who was standing in the exact right place." Eleanor said, "I was." Catherine was quiet for a moment. She looked at Eleanor, at the room, at the good furniture and the closed door and the quality of the staff's discretion, and then back at Eleanor. She said, in a tone that was entirely sincere, and not at all congratulatory in the ordinary social sense, "Tell me the true version." So Eleanor told her. She told her the whole of it, from the beginning. The letter on the tray, the staircase conversation, the notebook and the promise, the committee work and the charitable systems, the royal messenger and the meeting in the court offices, and the conversation in the room with the good chairs and the tea. She told her about the signing and the weeks of carrying it quietly, and the cathedral, and the moment when Dorian walked in and offered his arm. She told her all of it without leaving out the difficult parts, because Catherine was the person she didn't have to leave out the difficult parts for. So, Catherine listened to all of it. When Eleanor finished, she sat for a long moment. Then she said, "The letter on the tray." Eleanor said, "Yes. A housemaid's mistake. A housemaid's mistake." Catherine shook her head slowly. Imagine if she had put it on the right tray. Eleanor thought about this. It was a question she had considered. The letter had been addressed to her father, and if it had reached her father, the engagement announcement would have been made without Eleanor knowing anything had been happening. She would not have found the letter. She would not have understood the full extent of it until the announcement itself. She would not have had those weeks of knowing, and the particular quality of that knowing, the cold, clarifying anger of it, was what had shaken her loose. It was what had started her moving in the direction she needed to move. She said, "I don't know. I think I would have found a way to start regardless, but I don't know how long it would have taken." Catherine said, "I think you would have." She said it simply and with complete confidence. "I think you were always going to get here. The letter just moved the timetable." Eleanor looked at her friend. She felt something that was not quite sentiment and not quite gratitude but was related to both. The feeling of being known by someone over a long period of time, of being held in someone's accurate understanding, even when you were not presenting your best self, or your clearest thinking, or anything beyond the ordinary fact of yourself on an ordinary day. Catherine had seen her at committee tables and at dinner and in the sitting room with cold coffee and lists. Catherine had seen her the morning after the announcement and the evening before the wedding and in all the in-between time. And Catherine had seen her correctly. She said, "I am glad I told you." Catherine said, "I am glad you did too." A pause. "I want to see you when all of this settles, not in a formal sitting room with a tray." Eleanor said, "You will, I promise." Catherine said, "Bring the lemon cake context." Eleanor laughed, a real one, sudden and brief and entirely her own. And Catherine smiled. And for a moment, they were simply two women in their 30s, who had been friends for a long time, and who were sitting in a comfortable room with a warm tray. And the magnitude of what surrounded them was still true, but was not, in that moment, the most important thing. After Catherine left, Eleanor sat for a while longer in the sitting room. The afternoon was moving toward evening. She could hear the ordinary sounds of the residents around her. Movement, voices, the small domestic business of a place running smoothly. She sat and let the quiet be quiet. She was thinking about the next weeks. There was a great deal coming: formal introductions, public appearances, the adjustment of learning a new world without losing what she already knew about herself. There were people who would attempt to manage her, shape her, prepare her for a role through the lens of what the role had previously looked like, and she would need to be both willing to learn and steady enough not to be remade into something she wasn't. She thought about what Dorian had said about ceremony and substance, about the layer of ceremony that often confused itself with the thing it was supposed to serve. She thought about Dorothea's ledger. She thought about the clean single page that had replaced 3 separate notebooks full of confusion, and how the woman who had kept those notebooks for 6 years had looked at the clean page and asked why nobody had done it before. Eleanor had not had an answer at the time. She had one now, or the beginning of one, because cleaning things up required someone willing to see the mess as a problem, rather than as simply the way things had always been. Most people were remarkably willing to accept the way things had always been, especially when changing them required inconvenience. Eleanor was not most people. She never had been. She had simply spent a long time pretending to be, because it was easier and safer and because nobody around her had encouraged her to be anything else. She was not going to pretend anymore. She had signed a document that made that extremely difficult to do anyway, which was, she thought, an additional benefit she had not entirely anticipated. She opened her notebook. She looked at the full page she had written that afternoon. The beginning of the plan, the early shape of what she wanted to build. She read it through once. Then she turned to a new page and wrote a heading, "What I will not compromise." Beneath it she wrote 6 things. She was clear and specific about each one. She did not show the list to anyone, but she kept it, and she would return to it in the coming months, when the pressure of learning a new world tried to make her smaller than she was. She would return to it and remember that she had known exactly who she was on the evening after the wedding that had not been a wedding, sitting in a borrowed room in a pleasant garden residence, writing lists with her own pen in her own notebook with the particular satisfaction of someone whose life had found its proper shape. She closed the notebook. She put it in her bag. Tomorrow there would be meetings and decisions and the beginning of the formal process of becoming what she had agreed to become. Tomorrow there would be the wide world and its opinions, and the long work of demonstrating, over time and action, who she actually was. But tonight was still tonight, and the garden outside the window was going into dusk in its geometric way, and Eleanor Hartwell sat in the last of the light, and was quietly, firmly, entirely herself. Which was the whole point. which had always been the whole point. The world that Eleanor moved into in the weeks after the cathedral was both larger and more specifically complicated than she had anticipated, and she had anticipated quite a lot. It began with the formal public announcement from the Crown, which was released on the 6th day after the cathedral ceremony. Eleanor read the draft with Meredith before it was released, which was not the typical process. Meredith told her, without elaboration, that it had been Dorian's specific instruction that she see it first, and Eleanor had noted this as something that would prove characteristic of how he operated. He did not treat her involvement as a courtesy, he treated it as necessary, which was different. The announcement was precise and brief. It confirmed the betrothal, gave the date of the signing, named the witnesses, and stated that the formal ceremony of marriage would be held in the coming months. It referred to Eleanor by her full name and her family, and said nothing beyond what was factually required. Eleanor had suggested one small change of wording in the third sentence, and it was incorporated without discussion. The papers had already been running the story for 6 days by this point, and public opinion, from what Eleanor could gather through the careful filter of what Meredith and Edmund allowed to reach her, was complicated in the way that public opinion is always complicated when something unprecedented happens. There was significant support, particularly among people for whom the idea of a king choosing someone unexpected and outside the traditional selection of nobility felt like a meaningful signal. There was significant skepticism, particularly among those who distrusted anything that departed from convention, and who saw Eleanor's lack of traditional qualifications as a problem, rather than an irrelevance. There was gossip about Aldrich and Vivian and the wedding, which had eventually been rescheduled for 2 weeks after the original date in a very small ceremony with a fraction of the guests, and which had received considerably less attention than anyone involved in it had planned for. Eleanor tried to stay at the edge of all of this and not the center of it, which was less possible than she had hoped. She was recognized now in ways she had not previously been. People on the street had read her name and seen the illustrations that the papers had managed to obtain. She did not know from whom, and chose not to investigate. And the experience of being recognized by strangers was one she found she needed to adjust to deliberately, because her instinct was to make herself smaller and less visible, which was exactly the wrong response. She made herself instead be present. She made herself acknowledge the recognition without retreating from it. She did not perform, but she showed up. She held her posture correctly, and met people's eyes, and spoke in the direct and ordinary way she always spoke. And after a week or two of this, she found that the adjustment was not as difficult as she had feared. She was not performing a public version of herself. She was simply being herself in public, which was a skill she had, it turned out, been building all along in those committee rooms and morning walks and cathedral floor walks checking flower arrangements. Dorian watched this process with a quiet attention that she appreciated, because it was not anxious. He did not hover or correct or manage, he observed. When she did something well in a public setting, he said so afterward, briefly and specifically, not the general kind of praise that covers uncertainty, but the precise kind that comes from actually watching. When she made a mistake, and she made several, small ones, the ordinary mistakes of someone learning new protocols, he told her about them in the same direct way, once, without repetition. She found this deeply functional and said so. He looked mildly surprised. He said, "Most people don't find correction easy to receive." She said, "Most people associate correction with judgment. You are not being judgmental. You are being useful." He said, "Yes." A pause. "I have had experience with advisors who confuse the two." She said, "As have I." She was thinking of her father, who had offered little useful direction in her life, but had found many opportunities to deliver judgment in its absence. They were in one of the working meetings when this exchange happened, the 5th or 6th such meeting. She had stopped numbering them after the 3rd, and Edmund, who was across the table, had the grace to appear fully absorbed in his paperwork. The formal introduction to the wider court came at the end of the 3rd week. Not the full ceremonial version, that was being saved for the official occasion, but the practical version, the initial meeting with the senior members of the advisory council, the people who ran the daily operations of the kingdom and with whom Eleanor would be working for the rest of her life. She had been given briefing documents on each of them, which she had read thoroughly and had also set aside. Briefing documents told you what people had accomplished. They didn't tell you how they thought. She walked into that meeting room with Meredith behind her and found 8 people already seated at a long table, all of whom had the composed and measuring expressions of individuals who were deciding something about her. She recognized the feeling. She had produced it in others, sitting down at committee tables with her notebooks. She knew what it meant. They were assessing her. This was both inevitable and fine. She sat down. She introduced herself to each person individually before the meeting began. going around the table and asking each one not what their role was, she knew their roles, but what they were currently working on that they found most challenging. This was not a political move. It was simply what she wanted to know. The answers were informative. 2 of the 8 became visibly less guarded after she asked. One of them said something so honestly about a bureaucratic problem he had been unable to solve that Eleanor instinctively responded with a specific and practical suggestion, and he had written it down before he seemed to quite realize he was doing it. Dorian, seated to her left, did not say anything during this introductory period. She noticed he was watching the table rather than her, in the way of someone taking in the room's response to something, and she noted this also and filed it and moved on. The meeting itself was substantive. There were questions, not hostile ones but testing ones, the kind that probe the edges of what someone knows to find the limit. Eleanor answered what she knew and said clearly what she did not know yet, with the specific rider that she expected to know it within a defined period and would then be able to contribute more usefully. She thought one of the questions was poorly framed and said so, and rephrased it, and answered the rephrased version instead. One of the senior advisors, a man named Jeffrey who had been in his position for 20 years, and had the measured eyes of someone who had seen a great many people try and fail to convince him of things, looked at her with what she thought might eventually become respect, though it had not arrived there quite yet. After the meeting, Meredith walked with her through the corridor and said, without inflection, "That was very well done." Eleanor said, "I thought it was ordinary." Meredith said, "That is why it was well done." In the evenings she worked. She was developing the proposal she had mentioned to Dorian in the formal garden, the charitable infrastructure system, the scalable version of what she had been building in the district committees. She had the notebooks from that work, which Meredith had arranged to have brought from Hartwell Manor, along with Eleanor's other belongings. She sat with them and built from what she knew, layering on the new understanding she was gaining daily about how large systems operated, where the failures lived, what made the gap between official intention and actual outcome so persistent. It was the most interesting work she had done in her life. She was not going to say that out loud to anyone yet, but it was true. The scale of it, the genuine scale of what was now available to her as a field of action, was something she was still, quietly, adjusting to. For most of her life, the problems she had solved had been small ones. Important, real, genuinely helpful, but small. The systems available to her now were not small. The reach of what she could actually change, if she was careful, and persistent and willing to do the work over time rather than quickly, was not something she had words for yet. She wrote in her notebook at the end of one of those evenings, "This is what it means to have scope, to be able to match the scale of the problem with the scale of the resource, to not be limited to what can be done with 2 carts and good organization." She sat looking at that sentence for a while. Then she wrote beneath it, "Don't lose the 2 carts version. It is where you understood what the problem actually was. Big systems fail when they stop being able to see what the person with 2 carts can see." She underlined the last line. She would come back to it often. The letter from Vivienne came without warning, which was perhaps the most genuinely surprising thing that had happened to Eleanor since the beginning of all of this. It was not a long letter. It was not a graceful one. Vivienne had many gifts, but epistolary subtlety was not among them. It was, however, a real one. Eleanor could feel the realness of it through the paper, through the slightly uneven handwriting that suggested it had been written quickly and without much revision. Vivienne wrote that she had been thinking. She wrote that the thinking had been uncomfortable, which Eleanor believed, because uncomfortable thinking was not Vivienne's most natural state. She wrote that she had been sitting with a question that she could not quite leave alone, which was whether she had ever actually seen Eleanor, actually, clearly seen her, as opposed to simply looking in her direction while thinking about something else. She wrote, "I think the answer is that I didn't, not properly, and I am not sure why, except that I think I was so accustomed to you being simply there that I forgot you were someone." Eleanor read this sentence 3 times. She held the letter on her lap and looked out the window at whatever the current window was looking at. She was in a different set of rooms now, better situated, looking over a courtyard, and let the sentence sit. It was an honest sentence. She recognized honesty when she saw it. She had enough experience with managed sentences, with language designed to make the speaker comfortable rather than to convey truth, that the genuine article was immediately distinguishable. Vivienne had written something true and difficult. She had not wrapped it in enough softening to make it harmless. She had left the sharp edges on. She also wrote about the wedding. She wrote that it had happened, smaller, quieter, with none of the original guests except the family, and that she was now the Duchess of Voss, which was what she had wanted, she said, and she believed that was still true, though she wrote that sentence twice, which suggested it was doing some work. She wrote that Aldrich was attentive and organized and not unkind, And Eleanor noted the specific list of those 3 qualities and the qualities that were not on it. She did not write that she was happy. She wrote that she was settled, which was a different word. Eleanor thought about that difference for a moment. She thought about her sister and the bright, beautiful frame of her life, the social ease, the quick charm, the ability to make any room feel like it was glad she was in it. She thought about Vivian on the eve of the wedding, nervous in the seamstress's room. She thought about Vivian on the edge of the bed saying, "I hope you are not too disappointed," and then, later, saying, "I hope that whatever comes next for you is better than what you were waiting for." Vivian was not, and had never been, the simple version of herself that it was easier to be angry at. She was a person, a real and complicated person who had made choices that hurt Eleanor, and who had also, in her own fashion and her own timing, arrived at something resembling honesty about them. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, something. Eleanor wrote back the same day. She wrote carefully, which was her way, but she also wrote warmly, which was also her way when she allowed it to be. She wrote that she had received the letter and read it more than once. She wrote that the sentence about seeing her had been noticed and appreciated. She did not say that she forgave anything, because forgiveness was not something she had settled fully in herself yet, and she was not going to write a word she hadn't yet entirely earned. But she wrote that she hoped Vivian was well. She wrote that the family was not, in her understanding, a thing that needed to be ended even when it needed to be reorganized. She wrote that she would like to have dinner, the 2 of them, when things were settled enough on Eleanor's side to make arrangements. She meant it. She would not always mean things she said to Vivian, and she knew that, and she was going to be careful about the difference. But she meant this. She sent the letter and then sat quietly for a little while and thought about the complicated truth of loving someone who has let you down, which was not the same as forgiving them everything, and was not the same as taking up exactly the position you had occupied before, but was also not nothing, was also a real thing, was also a choice that required the same kind of deliberateness as any other choice worth making. She was capable of it. She had always been capable of it. She was just going to do it on her own terms now, at her own pace, within the limits of what she actually felt, rather than what someone else needed her to feel. The following week brought the first public appearance of any significance, not a formal ceremony, but an official visit to a district charitable office in the city, which had been arranged at Eleanor's specific request, as part of a series of working visits she was planning, to the kinds of organizations she had been building systems for over the past months. Meredith had organized it. Edmund had cleared the schedule. Dorian had said, when she presented the plan, that it made sense, which was his way of saying he thought it was exactly right. She arrived at the office on a Tuesday morning in a carriage that was less anonymous than she was used to, with 2 guards and Meredith, and she walked in through the front door of a room that looked very much like every committee room she had ever sat in, slightly overcrowded, slightly disorganized, staffed by people who cared very much about their work and had insufficient support for doing it. She introduced herself to the people in the room, all of whom knew who she was, but most of whom were clearly uncertain whether to treat her as a person or as a role. She shook hands. She asked questions. She asked to see the records. The records were, as she had expected, a familiar picture. She sat at the main table with the ledgers and asked for the person who managed them to walk her through the system. A young woman named Alice, who was 20 or so and had been managing the records for 8 months with no formal training, sat beside her and explained the system with the visible anxiety of someone who expects to be criticized. Eleanor listened to the whole explanation before saying anything. Then she said what worked and what didn't, in specific terms, and laid out in plain language what would make it better, and Alice wrote down everything she said with an expression of concentrated gratitude. The director of the office, a man in his 50s who had been watching this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read, came forward when Eleanor was finished with the records and said, "We have been waiting for this kind of attention for 3 years." Eleanor said, "You shouldn't have had to wait 3 years." He said, "No, but you are here now." She was here now, in this specific office and in the larger sense, in the position to actually change the systems that had needed changing, not just identify what needed to change and walk away. She was here, and she had work to do, and she was going to do it with the same steady, practical, unglamorous attention she had always brought to everything, except now the reach of it was different. Now the possibility of what could actually be fixed was something she was still only beginning to understand. She stayed at the office for 3 hours. She was supposed to stay for 1. Meredith, to her credit, simply rearranged the afternoon. In the carriage on the way back, Eleanor was quiet for most of the journey, writing in her notebook. When she looked up, Meredith was watching her with the expression she had learned to read as Meredith's version of approval, which was a very contained thing but recognizable once you had seen it a few times. Eleanor said, I want to do 12 more of those visits. Meredith said, I will arrange it. Eleanor went back to her notebook. She was writing fast now, the way she wrote when the thoughts were coming clearly and there was too much to capture slowly. She was writing about the district offices, about Alice and the records, about the director saying you are here now. She was writing about the things she had felt in that room, the same satisfaction she had felt in the committee rooms and the cathedral and at the table with the flood volunteers, the satisfaction of being exactly the right person in exactly the right situation doing exactly the right work. She was here. She was here now. And she was just getting started. The formal ceremony was set for the last week of autumn, when the city would be at its best, and the political timing, as Edmund explained in one of his careful briefings, was most advantageous for a public occasion of this magnitude. Eleanor had been given the choice of the date range, had selected it based on a set of practical criteria that Edmund had found slightly unconventional, and had not changed her mind when the social calendar advisors suggested an alternative week that had better precedent for royal occasions. She was learning, slowly and with some patience required on both sides, that there were people in the process who interpreted her practicality as a lack of familiarity with tradition, and people who interpreted it as deliberate and considered confidence, and that distinguishing between these two groups efficiently was worth the effort. Geoffrey, the senior advisor who had given her the measured look in the first council meeting, was moving into the second category. This had happened gradually. He had asked her a question in the fourth council meeting that was clearly designed to test whether she understood a particular historical precedent, and she had answered it with specific and accurate detail that he had not expected, and there had been a moment, brief, contained, entirely professional, where his face had rearranged slightly in the way of someone updating information. After the meeting he had stayed when the others left, and said, with the directness of someone who did not waste words, "Your knowledge of the administrative precedents is more thorough than I expected." Eleanor said, "I studied before I arrived. I continue to study." He said, "Most people in your position arrive and expect to be taught." She said, "I prefer to arrive prepared and be taught the things that can only be learned in the room." He had nodded at this in a way that was the closest she had seen him come to approval, and since then his questions had shifted. They were less testing now, and more genuinely interested in what she thought, which was a more useful kind of conversation for both of them. She was not naive about the larger political context. She understood that there were people within the court structure and beyond it who found her appointment problematic, and not all of them for reasons she could entirely dismiss. She had no traditional preparation for the role. She had no family with established court connections. She had no history in the specific social world she was entering. These were real gaps, and she was realistic about them. What she had instead was a set of qualities that she was prepared to demonstrate consistently over time, because demonstration over time was the only answer to skepticism that she had found to be reliable. She said this to Dorian one evening, in one of the working sessions that had by this point become something more than working sessions. They were still meeting about practical things. There was always a practical agenda, but the conversation around the practical things had opened up in the way conversations do when two people have spent enough time together to stop managing the surface of themselves quite so carefully. He said, "The skepticism will diminish, not all of it, not from all quarters, but most of it." She said, "How long?" He said, "Longer than feels fair." She said, "I know that already." He said, "I know you do." A pause. "I want to tell you something that I should perhaps have said before now." She looked at him. He said, "When I chose to come to the cathedral the way I did, the timing, the setting, I was following your instruction, but I want you to know that I thought about it for several days first. I want you to know that I understood what it would mean for the people in that room, and I agreed to it because you asked for it, and because I believed you had the right to ask for it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She said, "Are you telling me you had reservations?" He said, "I am telling you I considered it fully. There is a difference." She looked at him steadily. She said, "What were your concerns?" He said, "That it might appear designed, that people might see it as a performance rather than a truth." She said, "Did you decide it was a truth?" He said, "I decided that you had been placed in a position, by a series of people over a significant period of time, that was designed to be the final picture of your irrelevance, and that you had chosen the moment to dismantle that picture yourself. And that helping you do that was not a performance, it was the only accurate response to an inaccurate situation." Eleanor sat with this. She had thought about the cathedral often, about what it had been and what it had meant, and whether the way she had orchestrated it reflected the person she wanted to be. She had wondered, in quiet moments, whether she had done it for herself or for some other reason, for the message it sent, for the particular satisfaction of it, for something smaller and less defensible than she wanted to admit. Dorian's version of it was the version she had always believed privately but had not heard, said aloud by anyone else. It was an accurate response to an inaccurate situation. She had corrected a record that had been wrong. She had done it in the place and at the moment that were most suited to making the correction clear. There was nothing in that which she needed to be ashamed of. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "I should have told you sooner." She said, "You told me when I was ready to hear it, I think." He looked at her. He said, "You are very careful with yourself." She said, "I have had to be." He said, "You don't have to be in quite the same way now." She considered this. It was one of the things she was still working out, the difference between the careful self-containment that had protected her when she was in a situation where she was unvalued, and the version of herself she needed to be now that she was in a different situation. She was finding that the careful containment was a habit that had been so useful for so long that it felt dangerous to release it, even when the circumstances had changed. She was finding she had to remind herself, sometimes, that protecting herself from people who did not see her clearly was no longer the primary task. The primary task was allowing herself to be seen clearly by people who were capable of it and trusting them with what they saw. It was harder than it sounded. She said, "I am working on that." He said, "I know." The week before the formal ceremony brought a different quality of attention. The preparations for the occasion itself were Meredith's domain, and Eleanor trusted them to her completely, which freed Eleanor to focus on the things she wanted to do before the ceremony that had nothing to do with the ceremony itself. She went back to the 1st District Charitable Office for a follow-up visit. Alice had implemented 2 of the 3 changes Eleanor had suggested on the first visit and was working on the third. The records were cleaner. The director had found a small additional funding stream that the better record-keeping had made visible, money that had technically been available but had been inaccessible because nobody had been tracking it properly. Eleanor sat at the table with Alice and the director and they went through the new system together, and Eleanor made one additional suggestion, and Alice wrote it down, and the director said, "You are going to do this all over the country, aren't you?" Eleanor said, "That is the intention." He said, "Good." She visited 2 more offices that week. She was building a map in her head, the actual landscape of the charitable and administrative systems across the districts, where the failures were most concentrated, where the quick fixes were, and where the deeper structural problems lived. She was building the proposal she was going to present to the council within the month, and every visit added to it, made it more specific, more grounded in what was actually there rather than what she imagined from a distance. Catherine came to visit again on the Thursday of that week. She came in the afternoon, she brought lemon cake, and they sat in Eleanor's sitting room, the good one now, with the wide window and the proper chairs, and ate the cake and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with royalty or ceremonies or administrative systems. They talked about Catherine's garden and the particular difficulty she was having with one section of it, and about a book Eleanor had been reading that she thought Catherine would like, and about Philip's recent attempt to repaint the front room of their house and the disagreement they were having about the color. It was the best 2 hours Eleanor had spent in weeks. When Catherine was leaving, she paused at the door and said, "You look like yourself." Eleanor said, "I am working at it." Catherine said, "Keep working at it. Don't let it become the other thing." Eleanor knew what the other thing was, the role, the ceremony, the public version, the flat picture of Eleanor Hartwell that moved through the world slightly ahead of the real one. Catherine was telling her not to become the flat picture, not to manage herself into something that was easier for the world to hold but smaller than the truth. She said, "I won't." Catherine left. Eleanor stood at the window for a little while, looking at the courtyard below. A light rain had started, fine and quiet, the kind that doesn't demand attention. She thought about what it meant to keep being yourself when the world was trying to process a version of you that was simpler than you actually were. She thought about the quality of the work she had been doing, the visits, the proposals, the meetings, the notebooks full of specific and practical thinking. She thought about Jeffrey's updating expression and Alice's careful handwriting, and the director saying, "You are going to do this all over the country, aren't you?" She thought about the 14 things she had written in her notebook on the evening after the engagement announcement, the list she had made herself when she decided she was done waiting. She had not looked at the list in several weeks. She went to her bag and found the notebook and opened it to that page. She read the 14 things. She sat quietly with each one. Then she counted how many of them she was now, in some form, working toward. 11 of the 14. She sat for a long time with that number. She was not naive. She knew that being in the position to work towards something was not the same as having achieved it, and that the road from here to actual change in the systems she was trying to change was long, and would require patience she was still building. But 11 out of 14, in the months since she had made herself a promise in the dark of her room at Hartwell Manor, was something. She was 3 days from the formal ceremony, 3 days from the public confirmation of everything that had already been true since the day she sat in that quiet room and signed a document with 3 witnesses and a locked leather box. She put the notebook away. She went to look at the light rain. In 3 days she would stand in front of the world and be seen as what she was. She was ready to be seen. The day before the ceremony, Eleanor asked Meredith to clear the afternoon. Meredith looked at the schedule, then at Eleanor, then at the schedule again. She said, "There are 3 confirmations that need." Eleanor said, "I know. Move them to the morning." Meredith moved them to the morning. She did not ask what the afternoon was for. This was one of the things Eleanor had come to value about Meredith in the months they had been working together. She understood the difference between information she needed and information that was not hers to need. Eleanor spent the morning in meetings. She was focused and useful in all of them. She answered questions. She resolved 2 outstanding details about the ceremony that had been unresolved for days and simply needed a decision made, and she approved the final arrangement of the proceedings, which had been in good order since Meredith had been working on it, and was in better order than that now. Then she changed into simpler clothes and went out. She did not go far. She went to the older part of the city, which she had discovered 2 weeks earlier during a walk she had taken without announcement, choosing to be unrecognized for an hour in the way that only works when you are dressed simply and moving without the accompaniment that typically marks a public figure. She had found a small square with a fountain and 2 benches and a bookshop with excellent windows, and she had sat on one of the benches and read for 40 minutes, and nobody had known who she was. She went back to that square. She sat on the same bench. She brought the notebook. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say to herself. In the private way she said things to herself in the notebook, not to anyone else, not for any record, just the honest conversation she had with her own thinking when she needed to know what she actually believed. She had been thinking about what she wanted to remember from this particular period of her life, before the ceremony tomorrow moved her irrevocably from one state of things to another. She wrote for a while. She wrote about the past months, not the events of them, which she knew well enough, but the texture of them, the feeling of carrying the secret through the wedding preparations, the morning she had found the letter on the tray, the staircase conversation and the word placeholder, the committee rooms and Dorothea and the clean ledger, Catherine's face in the cathedral, Alice's careful handwriting, the director saying, "You are here now." She wrote about Dorian. She wrote honestly, in the private way she permitted herself in the notebook, about what she had come to know of him and what she trusted about that knowledge and what she was still uncertain of. She wrote about the things she felt in the room with the good chairs when she had stopped managing the surface of the conversation and simply talked, and he had talked back, and something had happened between those 2 kinds of talking that she did not have a precise word for but recognized as genuine. She wrote about what she wanted, not the formal version, not the professional version, not the version she presented in council meetings, the real version. She wrote about the kind of partnership she was building an understanding of, one where the substance was more important than the ceremony of it, where she was consulted rather than managed, where she was allowed to be difficult and right, and occasionally wrong, and always fully herself. She wrote about what it meant to be choosing this life, rather than being assigned it by someone else's design, and how the difference between those 2 things was the most important thing about all of it. She wrote, "I chose this, every part of it. I chose to say yes to the meeting, and yes to the signing, and yes to the moment in the cathedral. I chose who to tell and when and how. I chose how to use the time while the world was still thinking I was irrelevant. I chose to walk into the rooms that needed walking into, and to sit at the tables that needed sitting at, and to write in the notebooks and to show up prepared." She paused. She looked at what she had written. She wrote, "Nobody gave this to me. I built my way to it. The building happened in the wrong order and through the wrong door, and with people watching for entirely the wrong reasons, but it happened, and it is mine." She closed the notebook. She put it in her bag. She sat for a little while more in the square with the fountain, watching the city do its ordinary things, the people passing, the light on the old stone, the distant sound of ordinary commerce and conversation. She let herself be in it, just a person sitting on a bench in the afternoon, before tomorrow when she would be something the world would need to see with different eyes. A child crossed the square with a dog that was too large for her, straining against the lead. The child held on with both hands and a determined expression. Eleanor watched this for a moment and felt something warm and simple. She got up. She went back. That evening Dorian came to the suite of rooms she occupied, which he did sometimes in the evenings, not often, and always with the kind of knock that asked a question rather than announced a presence. She had come to find this quality of his consideration to be something she trusted, He had never once assumed access to anything he had not been clearly offered. She opened the door. He was in less formal dress than she usually saw him, a working coat, without the careful layering of public presentation. He looked more like the man in the court offices than the man at the cathedral, which she preferred. She said, "Come in." He came in. She had tea already made. She poured him a cup. They sat in the chairs by the wide window, looking at the courtyard where the light was going soft with the early evening. He said, "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" She said, "I am ready for it. I am also glad it is only once." He almost smiled. He said, "The ceremony itself is approximately 90 minutes. The reception following is 3 hours. The private dinner after that will be smaller." She said, "I know. I read the schedule 5 times." He said, "Of course you did." They sat for a moment. The evening settled around them. She said, "I went to the square today, the one with the fountain." He said, "I know the one." A pause. "Did it help?" She said, "It always helps. Ordinary places remind you that the world is larger than whatever you are currently navigating, and also that most of it is entirely indifferent to your navigation, which is useful information." He said, "I agree." He turned his cup in his hand. "I go to a particular bench in the park near the north gate when I need the same reminder." She said, "Do you manage to go without being recognized?" He said, "Less often than I would like." She said, "That will be my difficulty now too." He said, "Yes. I am sorry for that." She said, "Don't be. I knew what I was agreeing to." He looked at her. He said, "I know you did. But knowing something and experiencing it are different things, and I want you to know that I understand that, and that when the public life becomes too much, there is always—" He paused. "I will make room for the private life. That is a commitment I am capable of keeping." She believed him. She had spent months now learning the difference between what people said and what they were actually offering, and she believed this was the real offer. She said, "Thank you." He said, "There is nothing to thank me for. It is simply accurate." They sat with the last of the evening light. Outside, the courtyard was quiet. Tomorrow the world would be watching. Tomorrow the city would be dressed for the occasion, and the crowds would gather, and the ceremony would happen in all its formal and ancient way, and Eleanor Hartwell would stand in it as herself, without pretending to be less than she was, without managing herself into something more comfortable for people who had not expected her to matter. Tonight was still tonight. She said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Yes." She said, "When you watched me at the flood district, in the first hours, before you asked who I was, what was the exact moment when you thought something specific?" He considered this. He was quiet for a moment, not managing his answer, thinking about it. She appreciated this. He said, "There was a moment in the 3rd hour when 2 of the volunteer groups reached the same supply point at the same time, and there was a disagreement about the distribution. Both groups were right by their own logic. The disagreement was going to slow everything down." She remembered this. She had been at that supply point. He said, "You stepped into it. You listened to both sides. Genuinely, you actually listened. And then you said something that reframed the situation so that both sides could agree without either of them losing face. And then you moved away immediately, without waiting for them to acknowledge you or thank you. You just moved on to the next thing." She sat with this. She said, "I remember that. I don't remember what I said." He said, "That also what I noticed. You did not remember what you said, because you were not tracking whether it had worked for you. You were tracking whether it had worked." She looked at him across the cups of cooling tea and the quiet evening and the full weight of everything that had happened between that afternoon and this one, and she felt, very specifically, the feeling that she had been seen, not the public version of herself, not the cathedral version, not the composed and ready version she brought to council meetings. The actual her, the person on the supply path who said something useful and moved on. She said, "That is a good memory to carry." He said, "I thought so." They finished the tea. He left at a reasonable hour. She closed the door behind him and stood for a moment in the quiet room. Tomorrow. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had been developing and which was harder than it sounded. She let the day empty out. She let herself be resting, just resting, a person in a room, not a future or a plan or a purpose, just a person. She slept. The morning of the ceremony arrived without announcing itself, the way mornings always do regardless of what they contain. Eleanor was awake before the light came fully through the window. She had slept well, deeply, without the fragmented quality that sometimes visited her on nights before significant things, and she woke with the immediate and complete awareness of where she was and what day it was, which told her something about the quality of her readiness. She did not need a moment to remember. She was already there. She lay still for a few minutes. She looked at the ceiling, which was high and plain and without particular interest, and she let herself be in the ordinary fact of a body in a bed in a room on a morning, before all of the day's formality arrived to collect her. She listened to the building around her, the early sounds of staff already moving, the distant city beginning its daily business outside the walls, a bird somewhere close that was unaware of occasions. Then she got up. She had asked, specifically and clearly, that the morning be hers alone until the preparation hour. No briefings, no updates, no visit from Meredith until 9 o'clock. She wanted time to be simply awake before the day began requiring her to perform the being awake. She made herself tea. She sat at the window with it. The courtyard below was gray and cool and just beginning to lighten, the stone catching the first pale reach of morning. She sat with the tea and the quiet and the fact of the day. She thought about the 14 things in the notebook. She thought about the 11 she was working toward. She thought about the 3 she had not yet reached. They were the longer ones, the more structural ones, the ones that required the kind of time and trust and built authority that she was only at the beginning of accruing. They were not going anywhere. They would still be there to work toward in a year, in 5 years, in the long future of this life she had signed a document about in a quiet room with 3 witnesses. She thought about that life, not the ceremony of it, the actual life. The working days, the meetings and proposals and visits to district offices and Alice's careful handwriting and the clean ledger, and what happened when you took a complicated, disorganized thing and built it into something that worked. She thought about the scope of that work, the actual reach of it, the things she still did not entirely have words for. She thought about the 2 carts version and the instruction she had given herself not to lose it, because big systems fail when they stop being able to see what the person with 2 carts can see. She thought about Dorian. She thought about the bench in the park near the North Gate, which she had not yet visited but intended to. She thought about what it meant to build a life alongside someone who preferred to arrive prepared, who moved through rooms with specific rather than general attention, who had watched her for 11 hours on a difficult afternoon, and then spent 6 months quietly confirming what he had seen. She thought about what he had said on the evening before, that he would make room for the private life, and that it was a commitment he was capable of keeping. She believed him. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not that she was certain of all of him. She was not, because she was still learning him, and learning a person takes time, and could not be rushed without becoming something else, something less than the real thing. But she believed what he said, and the reason she believed it was not that he was charming or persuasive, or that he had said it at a moment designed to make her receptive. She believed it because it was consistent with everything she had observed over months of watching him operate, the way he consulted her, the way he said things directly and without elaboration, the way he did not try to manage what she felt but left room for her to feel it and report back, and trusted that she would. That was what partnership looked like. She had not known, until recently, that she had been missing it. She had not had a clear enough picture of it to know what to want, but she had it now. She finished her tea. She stood at the window for a little while longer. The courtyard was fully lit now, the morning properly arrived, the gray gone from the stone. She could hear the city more clearly, voices, movement, the particular energy of a day that held something unusual. She went to her desk and opened the notebook one final time before the day began. She did not write anything. She just looked at the page she had filled in the square by the fountain the afternoon before. She read the line she had underlined. "Nobody gave this to me. I built my way to it." She closed the notebook. She put it in the desk drawer. She would pick it up again after the ceremony, after the day, after the world had done what it was going to do with the occasion. She would pick it up and open a new page and begin the next list, because there was always a next list, because the work did not have a ceremony at which it ended. The work simply continued. Meredith arrived at 9 o'clock exactly, which was exactly when Eleanor had expected her. She came with the team that had been assembled for the preparation. 3 women who knew their work and did it without excessive conversation, which Eleanor appreciated. The dress had been designed over several sessions with a woman named Clara, who had the particular gift of listening to what a person said they wanted, and then building exactly that, rather than the version she had decided they should want. Eleanor had been very clear about what she wanted. The dress was its own kind of statement, not in the theatrical sense, not in the way of something designed to make a room fall silent, but in the quieter way of something that was undeniably appropriate and undeniably itself. The color was a deep, settled blue, and the line of it was clean. Eleanor stood while it was arranged around her. She looked at herself in the long mirror and felt none of the uncertainty she had once felt, in another life it seemed, though it was only months ago, looking at the green dress in her wardrobe at Hartwell Manor, and and wondering whether it was too much. This was not too much. This was exactly what was required, and nothing more and nothing less. Clara fastened the last detail. She stepped back. She looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone who has completed a piece of work they are satisfied with. She said, "You look like yourself." Eleanor said, "Good. That is what I was going for." Clara smiled and stepped further back, and Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror for one long, clear moment. She was not looking for flaws or checking for adjustments. She was simply acknowledging herself, the woman in the mirror, who had found a letter on a tray and made a promise in the dark and worn a green dress to dinner and reorganized ledgers in badly lit back rooms and sat in a room with a king and answered his questions honestly and signed her name to a document and stood at an altar holding someone else's flowers and then walked out of it on the arm of a man who had been looking only at her. She was ready. The carriages left from the residence in a sequence that had been planned down to the minute. Eleanor's carriage was the last of the formal procession, which meant she traveled through streets that were already lined with people who had come to see the occasion. She looked out the window, which was not curtained. She had asked that the curtains be left open, a small deviation from protocol that Meredith had arranged without apparent objection. She wanted to see the city. She wanted to see the people who would be part of this country for the rest of her life. The crowds were substantial, not frantic, not with the particular noise of something political, with the more particular sound of people who had come out to see something that felt significant and were allowing themselves to feel it. She saw faces she could not know. She saw children held up on shoulders. She saw an old woman standing very straight near the front of the crowd with an expression that was difficult to describe. Not joy, not celebration, but something steadier, something like recognition. Eleanor looked at that woman as the carriage passed. The woman was looking at the carriage. For one moment Eleanor thought she was looking directly at Eleanor, though this was probably not possible through the window in the distance. But she held the image of that face and carried it into the cathedral. The cathedral was the full formal version of itself, prepared not the way it had been for Vivian's wedding, which Eleanor had organized, but the way it was prepared by people who organized occasions of this specific magnitude, which was something beyond anything Eleanor had ever managed. The flowers were extraordinary. The candles were everywhere. Every surface of stone had been considered. The light through the high windows fell not in the modest pale lines she remembered from the first time she had stood here, checking arrangements, but in rich columns of the morning light of a day that was behaving well for the occasion. The cathedral was full, more than full, filled to capacity with a particular kind of attention, the focused collective awareness of a large number of people who understood that they were present for something they would remember. Eleanor walked the center aisle. Not as a bridesmaid this time, not holding someone else's flowers. She walked it as herself, without hurry, looking forward, her pace even and her back straight, and her face the composed and open face of someone who was not performing composure, but was genuinely in possession of it. She heard the sound of the room around her, the music, which was well chosen, and beneath it the particular hush of a crowd that is paying full attention, and she let it be there without letting it displace her from herself. She did not think about Aldrich. She did not think about Vivian or her father or any of the social world that had surrounded her life for the past year and shaped the particular path she had taken to arrive at this aisle. Those things were real, and she would continue to think about them in appropriate moments, but they were not the morning. The morning was this. The morning was the walk and the light and the room full of people and Dorian, who was already at the altar, and who was, as she had known he would be, looking only at her. She reached the altar. She stood beside him. She looked at him and he looked at her. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say in that moment that was not already being said by the fact of both of them standing there. Reverend Caldwell began to speak, not the same reverend who had been preparing to preside over Vivian's wedding, a different one, appropriate to this occasion, a man of considerable gravity and very good timing who had clearly done this before in the full formal sense. His voice moved through the cathedral with the ease of a voice that had been trained for these rooms. The words were old words. They had weight because they had been said many times before by people who meant them, and they had the additional weight now of being said by people who meant them, and who also understood each other well enough to mean something specific by them. Eleanor made her promises carefully, not as a performance, as a declaration. She chose each word as she said it, held it in her attention for a moment, meant it, released it into the room. She was not performing a bride. She was a person making specific and considered promises to another specific and considered person, in public, with witnesses, in the irrevocable way of something done in front of everyone you know and everyone who will come to know you. Dorian made his promises in the same way. She listened to them as she had listened to him in the court offices that first afternoon, with full attention, without evaluating them against what she wanted to hear, simply receiving them as the actual things he was saying. She believed them. She had established, over months of careful observation, that this was a person whose words were consistent with his actions, and that was the only reliable basis on which to believe anyone's promises, and it was sufficient. The moment the ceremony completed, not before it, not performing the emotion in advance, Eleanor felt something shift in the room around her that was also shifting inside her. Not a dramatic internal event, something quieter and more complete than drama. The feeling of a thing being properly finished and a thing being properly begun, both at once, occupying the same moment. There was a sound from the cathedral, not applause, not the kind of crowd response that belongs to entertainment, but the instinctive collective sound of a large group of people responding to something real. Eleanor heard it and let it be there without needing to process it immediately. Outside, when they emerged into the late morning light, the city was audibly different from the quiet of the earlier hour. The sound of the crowds reached them before the crowds themselves were visible, and it was the sound of a great many people giving themselves permission to express the feeling of the occasion, which was, Eleanor thought, a particularly human thing. The need for a moment that gives you permission to feel what you were already feeling. She stood in the light. She looked at the city. She thought about the girl in the badly lit back rooms. She thought about the woman who had found a letter on a tray and gone to the kitchen and not cried, and promised herself she was done waiting. She thought about the 14 things and the 11 she was working toward. She thought about Alice and Dorothea and Catherine and the clean ledger and the supply path and the old woman in the crowd with the steady, recognizing face. She thought about all of it, very quickly, as the light came down and the sound of the city surrounded her, and she thought, yes, this is what you were building toward. This is where the building was going. Then she stopped thinking and simply stood there, present, grounded, fully herself, in the morning of a day that belonged entirely to her. The work that was ahead of her was enormous and specific, and would take years, and would sometimes fail, and would require more patience than any single person could be certain they possessed. She knew this. She was not naive about the distance between a ceremony and a change in the world, or about the difference between having a position and using it correctly. She knew that the real work would not look like this morning. The real work would look like meetings and proposals and Alice's handwriting and ledgers in back rooms, scaled to something larger and harder and slower than she could fully picture yet. But she could picture the beginning of it. She had been building toward it for longer than she had known. And she was here. And she was ready. And the morning was bright. And the city was making a sound that was the sound of people present for something real. She looked at Dorian beside her. He was looking at the city. And then he looked at her. She thought about the bench in the park near the north gate. She thought about the working evenings and the plain table and the tea, and the way they talked about practical things, until the conversation became something more than the practical things, and the more was also welcome. She thought about beginning. She said, in a voice that was only for him, "What is the first meeting tomorrow?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, 7 in the morning. Edmund, the infrastructure report, and the district funding proposal. She said, "Good. I have 3 additional points for the funding section." He said, "I expect nothing less." She almost smiled. She did smile. He did too. The real one, the unrehearsed one that changed his face in the particular way she had come to watch for. The city made its sound around them. The morning light was exactly right. Somewhere in the crowd, Catherine was standing with Philip and watching, and her face was holding the expression that Eleanor would never quite see but could imagine clearly. That private, warm, completely sincere expression of a friend who had known all along. Eleanor stood in the morning and let herself be exactly where she was. She was here. She was the main thing. She was the story itself, not the background of anyone else's story. She was the woman who had found a letter on a tray and decided to be done with waiting, and she had kept that decision through every difficult and quiet and unglamorous and extraordinary thing that had followed, and she had arrived at this morning with the decision still intact, still hers, still the truest thing about her. She was not going to stop arriving.